Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge World War III update, our first show here in 2025. So I want to say Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, everybody. Of course, this is being recorded before new calendar theophany. So here we are still in the Christmas season. For those of you celebrating on the old calendar, Merry Christmas as well. You perhaps might be listening to this on Christmas Eve, I believe that might be when it is dropping. So I hope everybody, old and new calendar alike, has enjoyed the celebration of the birth of Christ and is enjoying this new year, 2025. The first quarter century of the 21st century has passed, and it has been quite an eventful few years here leading up to that. So we are going to be discussing all the fronts that have developed since our last episode, our 100th episode. Be sure to go back and give that one a listen. We thank a lot of special people there. So it's good to go back, but from Syria to Lebanon to the Turkosphere, big year for Turkey. We're going to be talking about that, to the big advances in Russia and Ukraine, the crazy terrorist attacks in the United States, huge things going on over in China with the East and everything going on there, Korea as well. A lot of these smaller satellite states that are caught in World War III are having a lot of turmoil right now. Huge election news in Europe, Germany, Austria, Romania, Bulgaria and Romania entering the Schengen zone, Georgia, the color revolution kind of slowly but surely coming to a halt. We're going to be getting into all of these things and more. And as we cover each sphere, we're sort of going to make our predictions for the coming year and reflect on 2024 and how our predictions went and kind of the big inflection points that we think are the most important to the World War Now story and how World War III has been developing. So with all of that, obviously, we're going to be talking about Syria and everything like that. But how are you doing, Dmitry? Happy 2025.
Happy New Year, Conrad, and Happy New Year to all our dear listeners, and potentially Merry Christmas again, and a blessed feast day for those of you listening after the 7th of January, of course, on the old Julian calendar in 2025. It's a great time to sort of record this episode just at the end of Nativity fast on the 4th of January, Conrad. But most importantly, looking at the foreign policy aspect of the Middle East, I think right now, honestly, we're all aware that there is a hot war going on in Syria. The country is torn apart. And essentially, most of the aspects of, say, warfare and even modern warfare that we speak about actually touch on Syria very closely. For example, we spoke about agriculture, food shortages around the world, which the Third World War will most likely bring about. For example, in Africa and the Middle East, the shortages in grain shipments, we see that in Russo-Turkish-Ukrainian relations on the Black Sea. That was a big story all across of 2024 and sort of the big grain deal discourse that took place even early in 2023. That same story has progressed here as the SNA and, of course, HTS move against the Kurds in the east of Syria at the moment. Actually, as we speak, in Deir ez-Zor and towards the Euphrates, the Turkish-backed and I would say HTS-supported SNA, and essentially even you can say not just SNA, the Syrian National Army, but literally Turkish soldiers are moving against the Kurds who are controlling these very key areas. Now, why is the east of Syria...
Yeah, big convoys too.
Oh, yeah. But why is that area so important? Like, just so people understand, well, not only are those parts of Syria adjacent to Iraq, which is, again, the gateway and essentially the land bridge to Iran, which, again, we'll discuss further on as we sort of get into detail about our predictions for the rest of the year and the coming probably hot war against Persia, which will most likely take place this year. But these are also the areas which, again, have the majority Euphrates, Tigris adjacent grain fields, where most of Syrian food actually comes from, which is why Syria has been experiencing essentially a humanitarian, nutrition-based crisis over the last decade, which has resulted in a lot of deaths. We see similar things in Gaza at the moment, obviously in the Israeli sort of man-made concentration camp, which it turned the Gaza Strip into. But in Syria, it's just been a prolonged issue. For those of you recalling the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, or even the 1990s blockade of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's sort of mismanagement of the food shortages in Iraq actually allegedly led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis over the decades leading up to the Iraq-US war. So it's a real issue in this part of the world, sort of managing food, managing bread. And unfortunately, for some peculiar reason, the US and the Kurds, of course, who are allied with the US, do control some of these key areas related to oil, which again, most of Syria's oil is in the east, which is why the Syrian economy has been so stifled by sanctions and essentially the inability of the US actually of providing the Syrians any oil, naturally because they were at war. They didn't recognize the government of Bashar al-Assad. And statistically speaking, 25 to 33% of that oil that was gathered by the Kurds, gathered by, surprisingly, ISIS and US over the last 10 years in Syria was actually going to Israel, funny enough. So it's Turkey, Azerbaijan, and unfortunately Russia as well. And whoever controls those eastern parts of Syria, these were the nation states and organizations providing oil to Israel over the last decade. So it's a very key area of Syria, which at the moment, the transitional government of Syria, led by al-Jolani, naturally HTS, and of course the Turkish-backed proxies in the form of SNA, which at the moment, mind you, it isn't exactly clear if the SNA, the Syrian National Army, this is essentially the Turkish-backed rebels who took power just 2 weeks ago in December, are on the same speaking terms with HTS, if they're exactly aligned one-to-one with this new sort of al-Qaeda-backed government of HTS or not. Because again, we see all kinds of media stories coming out of this Islamist-occupied Syria. Interesting stories that, for example, the HTS media, why would you think the HTS controls media? It's because they have most of the news stations in Damascus, in Aleppo, and in Idlib, some of these major cities. So they're broadcasting whatever they want across all of Syria. And some of the stories they're putting out there are that, well, the Turkish-backed SNA are oppressing certain Syrian minorities, such as Christians, Alawites, Yazidis, Druze, etc., across Syria. So they're kind of painting themselves as this new Islamic solution to Syria rather than having a Turkish-backed proxy government. So there is some tension, Conrad. It isn't just a sort of one-to-one friendship. It isn't really as tight of a relationship as probably they would have hoped for initially when they allied themselves against the Bashar al-Assad government, almost like a pack of wolves. Now that they've torn apart their prey, they've killed the mammoth in the sort of ancient landscape. Of course, Syria, the ancient land upon which Gilgamesh and Enkidu walked a long time ago. They have that grave of Abel from the allegedly where Cain killed Abel and Abel was buried by Adam and Eve, is located just outside of Damascus. This is a very ancient land, and now that they tear it apart, perhaps these wolves won't exactly organize amongst themselves as to who exactly will run this country going forward into the future. So we can't necessarily speak about the Syrian civil war being over because for all intents and purposes, it continues. And yes, the east of Syria looks like it'll be the next hot zone of conflict. The only question will be, will the Americans back the Kurds or continue to back these Kurdish rebels, these are the PKK? Of course, these are the Marxist Kurds and, of course, the official Kurdish resistance rebels who have organized themselves in a much more, shall we say, secular, maybe Sunni-backed resistance. And they've been holding out in the eastern parts of Syria for a long time now. Some of the media, I think online, has painted the Kurds as sort of freedom fighters, when in fact, the Kurds have essentially occupied a portion of Syria, which frankly, Syrian people, like ethnically speaking Syrian Arabs, Levantine Syrians also live in this land. So it's not like the east of Syria is exclusively some sort of Kurdish operating zone where it's mostly controlled by the Kurds. It's just simply that the Kurdish military, these Kurdish rebels have taken control of this area. And now moving forward, they're not really coming to an agreement with the HTS oppositionary government in Damascus, nor the SNA-backed Turks. And Erdogan is putting out a very clear message that the Kurds will be removed from power across all of Syria. And this is why the Turkish Air Force, we can see it right now, carrying out very powerful bombardment raids all across the eastern part of that war-torn country. So very sort of intense fighting. It continues. And amongst all of this, again, Conrad, we have these mixed messages being sent from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs about what exactly will take place with the base in Tartus and the base in Khmeimim, as all the other Russian outposts and bases across Syria have been systematically abandoned. And of course, in our previous 100th episode of World War Now, we discussed how there were rumors and there was even footage of Russian equipment being shipped to Libya. So it's almost as if the Russians are abandoning their operation in Syria in their entirety. So a lot of changes taking place in Syria, and the story is far from over.
Now we're going to get into the Russian situation in Libya in our Africa segment a bit later in the show, but I think everything you said there is spot on, and everybody has to remember the situation in Syria, an objective, huge W for Turkey. I mean, I'll probably make this point throughout the episode and expand upon it, but I would say Turkey and Israel being the two biggest winners of 2024 overall. Turkey explicitly in this situation for how they've managed to, both of these states really, Turkey and Israel managed to play the middle, not pick any sides too dramatically, support Ukraine just enough to not provoke the Russians to actually do anything. So they maintained frame on that issue, and now they're just eating up territory in Syria as we speak, and the Russians are gone, the Iranians are gone. And of course, in Syria, I think the U.S. decided that we're going to give our allies, Turkey and Israel, a dub here, even if it's an objective L for us, because we would rather get rid of Assad. And they've decided that they have the capability to defend the Kurds in the region, but yeah, they probably they probably don't like the SNA and HTS being the people that have taken over directly, as opposed to they funded groups like the Syrian Free Army, for example, which actually operated in the south during the fall of Damascus and the fall of Syria. And obviously everybody has read the reports that talk about how the U.S. was caught off guard. They had some warning that something was going to happen from HTS in Syria, but didn't know exactly. Obviously, the U.S. is trying to maintain its distance, but again, the U.S. played a critical role in allowing this to happen explicitly in getting the Russians out of Syria. And this is from the Cradle I'm reading here. They're reporting on some stuff reported by the Telegraph as well. So it says, according to the Telegraph, RCA, which is the Free Syrian Army, which is the United States anti-Assad group that operates in the south closer to Damascus, RCA and the fighters of HTS were cooperating, and communication between the two forces was being coordinated by the Americans. This collaboration proved to be of devastating effect in the lightning offensive, with RCA rapidly seizing key territory across the country upon explicit U.S. orders. RCA even joined forces with another rebel faction in the southern city of Daraa, which reached Damascus before HTS. RCA now occupies roughly 1/5 of the country, pockets of territory in Damascus and the ancient city of Palmyra. Hitherto heavily defended by Russia and Hezbollah, Moscow's local base has now been taken over by the RCA. All members of the force continue to be armed by the U.S., receiving salaries of $400 monthly, nearly 12 times what the Syrian Arab Army soldiers were paid. And Dimitri in the previous episodes made the very important point about how underpaid the SAA forces were. But again, this past week, at least since episode 100, we've seen in places like Homs and Damascus some Syrian Arab Army cells fighting against HTS and the SNA explicitly in some of these places. And there's rumors that these are being led by Mar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's brother, who was a general in the military. But unfortunately, it seems like these groups are being put down fairly easily by HTS in these groups. But you're talking about the ongoing war between the Turkish Syrian National Army directly, the Turkish army itself. There's huge columns of Turkish trucks and troops, as well as the huge airstrikes that they've been conducting across northeastern Syria on the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is, of course, the U.S.-backed group that have allied themselves with the PKK and the YPG. And every day we're seeing more and more images and reports of the YPG and PKK releasing images 5, 6, 7 at a time of their soldiers that have been killed in these airstrikes. And the most tragic thing about this is how these Kurds fight. They love putting their women at the front lines. So you see all these YPG videos, and like half of the death count is always these women in their tacticals. And it's just so ridiculous that, of course, that's the group that the United States is funding and making sure that they never come to the table with the Turks to sign an agreement. And we're going to be not just their men for them to die. And obviously the prophecies we know do talk about Kurdistan being real, but they're going to, I guess, put their women on the front line as well. So it's very unfortunate. Of course, you mentioned their communism and their progressivism. We know, much like, certain far-right people in the past have gone to fight. Well, frankly, on either side, Ukraine or Russia, Antifa leftoids, they like to go to Kurdistan and fight there against Turkish forces or against Syrian Arab Army forces, for example, if they join up with the YPG or the PKK. So as much as I support the prophecies, not support them, I just view them as correct. Kurdistan may exist. It's, I'm pretty ambivalent on the overall issue, but proving that the Syrian Free Army directly basically overthrew the Russian presence in Syria to allow the HTS to go in. I mean, it's so obvious. The U.S. even gave the HTS, they didn't have to be the ones to directly overthrow the Russian base. So now I'm sure HTS will have a much easier time getting in the good graces of the Russians. We're hearing from Lavrov and these other people and, the former Syrian ambassador to Russia, who I was in the same room with at the Russophiles conference. They're all bad-mouthing Assad. Lavrov said that Assad's failure to unite his country and provide basic services in the midst of the civil war is why he fell, all these sorts of things. And again, we know he's in Moscow. We're hearing lots of propaganda about his wife leaving him and whatnot. The only thing I know from trusted sources is she is getting bone marrow cancer treatment and transplants and whatnot. I don't necessarily believe any of the Israeli Turkish sources about her fleeing and getting a divorce in the United Kingdom or something like that. But at the end of the day, it is clear that al-Jolani is meeting with European foreign ministers. He's going to Riyadh. Everybody's going. The Turkish foreign minister is meeting with him in these big meetings. So it's clear that they are going to be normalized. And the question is, how quickly will Russia hop on that train? And of course, the ongoing clashes between the Kurds and the Turkish forces. I mean, I almost wonder what the Russians are thinking about this at that point. Obviously, I think considering that they withdrew and are now refocusing on Ukraine, obviously, I'd say that they would support the Turks ostensibly, which is just unfortunate. We've said in the past, we've read Strelkov's warnings from 2018, 2020, 2023, all these years. He's even mentioning the prophecies, talking about how Russia is sleepwalking into destruction with their ignorance and over the Turkish belt developing to their south. And yet still they would probably support the Turks because they are kind of solely focusing on US and NATO as their enemy right now, forgetting that Turkey is the biggest NATO country on their front door, or rather on their bottom floor, I guess you could say, down there on the Black Sea. So I guess before we move on to what's going on in Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, the other countries surrounding Syria, I'm wondering your thoughts on that and how the Russians are viewing this, what they're going to be doing with Assad still in Moscow, and how the Turkish belt is going to affect Russia's reshuffle here.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of mixed messages. And frankly, I mean, we've come to the unfortunate conclusion that the Assad Ba'ath government, this is the Arab socialist government, which ran in, of course, Iraq as well as in Syria over the last few decades, and both governments have fallen. These are the Arab socialist republics, of course, set up by Assad's father and those before him, those few military commanders. This particular system of governance has fallen in the Middle East. The Middle East is transitioning into really like a post-1979, since the revolution in Iran, this really Islamic-dominated landscape and an Islamic form of governance, where you even see the Minister of Justice in Syria at the moment. He's literally not even a student of law in any capacity. This is we're talking about Shadi al-Waisi. He's essentially a Sharia scholar. So the new Minister of Justice in Syria is a Sharia scholar. And so we see all of the Middle East essentially transitioning away from this very secularist 20th century Cold War era nationalism into a more Islamic, religious, possibly civilizationally defining regimes. And I think in some ways this is a good thing because, again, it's almost like taking off these rose-colored lenses set up by these Western imperial regimes such as, the empires of France, England, and again, the United States, and those who contributed into dividing the Middle East under like John St. Philby and Lawrence of Arabia, right? After the end of the First World War and before the Second World War, and even thereafter, of course, with the establishment of the Zionist state, that status quo is again being torn apart. But again, the unfortunate thing is it's not just being torn apart by the Islamists who are taking force. There are also all kinds of proxy wars taking place and intelligence agents from the UK, from the US, ISA, Mossad, all these ISIS-controlled CIA assets roaming around, essentially causing most of these regimes to either collapse or to, of course, come to power. And there are also rumors that, of course, the Ikhwan, the sort of Muslim Brotherhood, Middle Eastern alternative to these secular regimes, is also very deeply Masonic. This is what the current El-Sisi government of Egypt is pushing, this idea that the Qatar, Turkey-backed Muslim Brotherhood that was shut down in Syria initially, and now it seems that it's very pro-HDS, this designed Muslim Brotherhood. And again, unfortunately, they were also behind Hamas as well initially. Hamas was almost like a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood to begin with. The Muslim Brotherhood was deeply Masonic, and we know who controls Freemasons. It's, of course, those power players in Paris and London. So again, it's always Western-backed. And again, we understand that means Talmudic actors controlling most of what's happening in the Middle East. It's not like the Middle Easterners have achieved some sort of independence with the fall of Assad, with the fall of Saddam Hussein, or even the short-term presidency of Morsi, which took place in 2013. But Assad at the moment is just being held in this state of essentially house detention in Moscow. I think and even the fact that Putin, during his massive press conference at the end of December, he did state, he was asked, have you met Assad yet, right, personally? And Putin said, no, I haven't gone to meet him. Can you imagine a country which was so directly allied with Russia that they housed thousands of Russian troops over time? And Prigozhin even stated that over the entire Syrian war, 4,000 Russian troops and Wagner troops jointly have died in combat during the Syrian war. This is an enormous number of troops for a foreign expedition. So Russians have put down their lives in this particular country, and Putin openly has stated that he's not met Assad yet in December. And this is after Assad. This is a week into Assad traveling to Moscow. So Putin kind of showing his disrespect as if Dr. Assad was just this random diplomat that shouldn't meet with Putin. He needs to meet with one of his subservients like a Lavrov or Mikhail Bogdanov or somebody else from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's almost like a power play. It's some sort of 48 laws of power play that Putin's doing here. But what's the importance of Dr. Assad and his family staying in Moscow? It's just that we spoke about this, Conrad, but President Assad, his personal knowledge, the information that's in his head, that he probably hasn't written down the information he has about the Middle East, the status quo, certain alliances, unspoken agreements that the various emirs, muftis, imams, kings, and even presidents of the Middle East have, and all the agreements and various relationships that these Muslim as well as Jewish power players in the Middle East have amongst themselves and with Syria. All of this Assad knows by meeting with these leaders in person, things that are spoken about behind closed doors. Assad knows, and he knows all about these affairs, probably even from his father, was what his father, Hafez al-Assad, told him in person. And Assad essentially at the moment is an intelligence asset to Moscow. And it's thus not surprising that they put him and his family on this high-speed Ilyushin plane and, of course, rescued them from Damascus, leaving other members of the Assad family behind in Syria. And as you mentioned, some of them perhaps are fighting back. We've also seen executions of members of the Assad family all across Syria and sort of these extrajudicial hangings off of cranes and things that, we saw back then in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So it's quite gruesome, but nevertheless, at the moment, there are these bizarre rumors coming out of The Economist, the Economic Times, for example, that Assad, who's only 59 years of age, fell seriously ill in Moscow, was taken to a particular hospital. Again, the name of the hospital isn't named because these are very unsubstantiated rumors posted on Telegram by an account called General SVR. And he stated that Assad was taken to hospital after caught uncontrollably severely coughing and choking. So again, these rumors, the scapegoating of the former Syrian regime with which Russia was so closely allied, and Russia didn't have many allies since the 2014 acquisition and again the referendum in Crimea since the beginning of this massive wave of sanctions. So kind of this disrespect towards a former ally, I think from the Russian side, it's not a good look, diplomatically speaking, even going forward with Russia kind of aligning itself with all these other, shall we say, borderline rogue Middle Eastern groups, as well as possibly Russia's future allyship with East Asian and maybe Southeast Asian and African, South American countries. They also look at how Russia treats its former sort of allies very closely. And I think this is diplomatically speaking, it's a really false message of power that's being sent from the Russian elites towards their international new allies that they're seemingly kind of keen on acquiring now with this new BRICS multipolarity coming into the geopolitical chessboard of world affairs, right? They're kind of putting themselves out there as this new leader of the multipolar world whilst disrespecting a former fallen, perhaps a downtrodden ally. But I do want to mention real quick just the proximity of, again, and the silence being given by Russia towards Israel's occupation of quite a large portion of Syrian territory at the moment, extending to Mount Hermon, which we know biblically speaking, Hermon is where the snow melts and again it flows into the Jordan, which then where our Lord and Savior was baptized at some point 2,000 years ago. And then, of course, the River Jordan flows into the Dead Sea. And this is a very key particular mountain. No comments were made by Russia or anyone really important in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in relation to Israel's occupation. And there was no commentary on Israel's intense bombardment and destruction of Syrian military infrastructure. Now, last thing I want to mention real quick, but we mentioned the dissolution of the SAA, the demoralization of the Syrian Arab Army, and how a lot of these essentially former Assad-aligned Syrian soldiers, generals, officers essentially just went home and abandoned their war posts, which is why Syria fell in a span of 2 weeks. What they don't realize, Conrad, is just like after the end of the First World War, when the Russian officers mobilized troops and conscripts went home, what Leon Bronstein Trotsky did during the Russian Civil War was he forcefully mobilized and conscripted them back into the Red Army, usually under threat, threatening their families. We know many officers had essentially their families placed into home detentions until they served in the Red Army during the term of the Russian Civil War, which is why the Reds even won the Russian Civil War, because they had actually trained officers fighting for them, essentially under threat of extreme coercion for the health of their families and their well-being. The same will happen here. HDS, the SNA, they will remobilize and reconscript these former Assad-aligned soldiers back into their armies, and they will send them as cannon fodder against the Kurds in the east. So there is no real escape from war for the unfortunate Syrians, even who perhaps sought refuge in their little villages and towns, hoping that HDS will simply transition Syria into a peaceful age. I doubt that very much. So essentially, for those wishing to escape war, running away home and hiding with your families in your holiday house or somewhere out in the country and being a sort of libertarian Syrian really isn't possible, because the military recruiters, just like in Ukraine, they will come around, they will recruit you into the new sort of army of the Emir of Idlib, and you will be recruited to sent to war against either it's Jordan, Lebanon, or again the Kurds in the east, and you will be serving the global Azog. That's if you abandon your post and if you, of course, abandon the interests of your nation, which is what took place in December, unfortunately. So cowardice is usually not rewarded historically, and unfortunately, and being lukewarm towards warfare. If your country is being invaded by proxies and by international forces, that's typically not rewarded either. Simply sitting on your bum or trying to escape a draft or conscription. Somebody even worse than who's trying to conscript you will come for you, and they will send you to fight against your own interests. So that's quite unfortunate. Syria at the moment is in a state of crisis. And I would say at the moment, you're right, Turkey is the greatest victor in terms of foreign policy in 2024. It's expanded all across Africa, in the Middle East, the regime that's now in Syria. And again, we know Turkey is Qatar aligned as well. So in many ways, you can almost say that despite the fact that Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia has sent out delegates to meet in Damascus with al-Jolani. Even Saudi Arabia took a blow because we know Dr. Assad, President Assad of Syria, did try to have a rapprochement and build a new relationship with the states of Arabia and, of course, Saudi Arabia first and foremost, whilst Qatar was funding these rebels and terrorists all throughout the last few years during the COVID pandemic. And again, we know that Qatar came out ahead, Turkey came out ahead, and of course, Saudi Arabia now has to play catch up. So even amongst the Wahhabis and Islamists, there's almost a small degree of disagreement because we do have, of course, we all recall the 2021 Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia situation, of blockading of Qatar, which Iran, of course, assisted Qatar in allowing them to ship certain goods and saving Qatar from essentially an economic humanitarian crisis all the way back during the COVID pandemic. So the Middle Eastern relations are becoming more and more complex. But I think behind all of this is the great victory of Israel, which we see expanding to Mount Hermon, the rabbis having their bizarre rituals on the mountain, the pushing down of the Christian cross on Mount Hermon, again, the reestablishment of that cross by stating that, well, the HDS government is now tolerant of its Christian minorities. Again, all of this sort of rhetoric, it kind of just flies in the face of the reality that Greater Israel is well and truly expanding. And maybe, Conrad, overall, like objectively speaking, as we zoom out and look at what's taking place in the Middle East, it's almost as if Syria is being not just genocided, but the land is being cleared for an expansion of Israeli interests into the future, perhaps 2, 5, maybe 10 years later, when all this land will be plowed and, of course, then seeded with Israeli interests going forward. So it's not a good look, I think, for the Arabs, with the Levantine people fighting amongst themselves whilst the greater enemy grows in power.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Qatar as well, because I completely agree. As we've both said, Turkey, big winner, Israel, big winner. Qatar, in many ways, they're kind of an ally of Turkey, but they come off as more outwardly anti-Israel. But we have to start asking some big questions here, and that is that we know that Hamas was, again, I don't believe there weren't genuine people in Hamas. I don't believe the resistance in Hamas right now isn't on the ground and legitimate, but Hamas was put into political power over Fatah, over other Palestinian groups, over more secular groups to give the Zionist regime and the Netanyahu regime a pretext to do annexations and do attacks and be more aggressive against Gaza. And now we see, of course, Turkey and them being so successful, them, their proxies being fully the ones now in power in Syria. Assad is gone. Again, somehow, as everyone had eyes on Gaza and Palestine, somehow one of the main supporters of Hezbollah was then overthrown by members of this Islamic faction. I mean, again, the craziness on that is just one thing, but we have to remember that in the past few weeks, 500,000 Turks participated in the pro-Palestine march, and it was is in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and the name of the march was Hagia Sophia yesterday, Umayyad today, Al-Aqsa tomorrow. Meaning, of course, we already have the Hagia Sophia. We just got the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which is the main Islamic site there. And then in the future, we will be at Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Meaning, very neo-Ottoman. This is Turkey presenting itself as the new caliphate, as the new protector of Muslims around the world. And there was big posters of Yahya Sinwar and other Hamas leaders. Of course, no Shia figures, no Hezbollah, no axis of resistance, none of that. And we have to start to ask the question is, with the knowledge of Hamas's previous support by the Netanyahu regime, is this Qatar, Sunni, Turkish, Muslim Brotherhood-backed anti-Palestinian resistance, is that fundamentally the patsy? Is that the false opposition? Is that the opposition that is propped up against the real opposition, which you could describe as the Shia Crescent, Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, the Assad regime, and then, of course, Iran itself, and obviously the Houthis, who we are about to get into here very shortly. But I think these are questions everybody needs to ask because, again, Turkey, huge military power. They're ramping up their military production, their shipbuilding. They have this big hand in Syria. They have their hand with the resistance in Hamas. They're, this big party. Yet what are they actually doing to counter Israel? And the answer is effectively nothing. And this is from antiwar.com. Israel launches major airstrikes against North Syria. Syria's new government may view peace with Israel as a top priority, but Israel seems to be heading in a different direction. As the airstrikes continue to escalate against sites across Syria, and Israeli ground forces are taking more and more strategic locations in southern Syria. Locals reported huge explosions in the Syrian city of al-Safira, just east of Aleppo. There were at least 7 airstrikes reported against different targets in the city, mostly targeting defense industry factories, but also some hitting research centers in the area. The attacks were carried out overnight Wednesday into Thursday morning. Locals said the explosions were huge. They turned night into day. There are still no official figures on the casualties for many of these latest attacks, but there certainly were many. This is a continuation of the Israeli attacks on Syria's military infrastructure, strikes which have escalated since the recent regime change. Israel may have backed that regime change, but it's not stopping them from attacking Syria every chance they get. On Wednesday, Israel also carried out an attack on the Tal al-Shaham military camp. The camp is near Damascus and overlooks the southern Quneitra province. Since Israel is in the process of occupying more and more of that province, the camp apparently was perceived as a potential obstacle to their ground operations. Israel used the regime change as a pretext to seize substantial land in the demilitarized zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria. Since then, they've moved deeper into Syria, and Wednesday they reached the Al-Mantara Dam in Quneitra province. The dam is the largest in southern Syria and gives them effective control over the 6 major sources of fresh water in southern Syria. They have also recently taken the Al-Wad Dam along the Yarmouk River basin. So, again, it seems that the Islamic world was happy to see Assad fall, is happy to see Iran pulled out of the region, and is happy to embrace this, I guess, neo-Ottoman Turkish future. But what does that really mean? Syria is being gobbled up from the south by Israel, and despite the fact that, obviously, the most self-interested reason, and probably the main reason Turkey is going in, is to fully eliminate their ultimate enemy, the YPG and the PKK, these Kurdish militias, that is giving a new pretext for the U.S. to come in and bolster their number one ethnic ally in the region, the Kurds. And this is also from Anti-War. U.S. sets up new North Syria base with allied Kurds near Turkish border. At a time when Turkey is warning the U.S. to end its support for Syrian Kurds, the U.S. and its coalition partners appear to be heading in the opposite direction. The U.S. is reportedly building a new military base in the Kurdish majority city of Kobani, right on the Turkish border. The U.S. has been backing the Kurdish SDF for years to the chagrin of Turkey and its allies in the self-proclaimed Syrian National Army. In recent weeks, the intense fighting has erupted between the SDF and Turkey and their partners in the SNA. So far, the fighting has centered around the city of Manbij, which is further west than Kobani, but also along the Syria-Turkey border. Turkish military officials are quoted as saying they believe they are close to achieving victory in Manbij. The U.S. has been really trying to, this is me adding this in, the U.S. has been really trying to insist that the ceasefire has been holding, but that's just a total lie as they continue to get pushed back by the Turks. They've taken a few other places as well. It's a real battle going back and forth, but not that the fighting in and around Manbij is not slowing down. The SDF has launched artillery strikes against the outskirts of Manbij, and the SNA is conducting heavy attacks against SDF positions near Tishrin Dam, even further west. Even if the fighting in and around Manbij is settled, that won't be the end of the SNA or Turkey's offensive into Kurdish territory. Kobani is clearly at the top of their list of targets after Manbij, and villages near Kobani were reportedly shelled by Turkey. The SDF also reported shooting down a Turkish drone near Kobani. Turkish officials say their goal is to wipe out the YPG, a Kurdish faction which is the largest constituent of the SDF. Turkey backed the recent regime change in Syria, and their new Islamist leadership in Damascus is talking about how the Kurds can't be allowed to retain the autonomy they carved out during the Syrian civil war. The HTS has been a bit more pro-Kurd than the SNA, obviously, but they're trying to keep the SNA on their side so they can only do so much. Where the U.S. fits in all of this, fighting over northern and northeastern Syria, remains to be seen, but that the U.S. is setting up another base smack in the middle of this suggests it's going to be insinuating itself into the situation one way or another. The Pentagon, however, continues to insist that the ceasefire between Turkey and the SDF is holding, despite Turkey insisting the ceasefire never existed in the first place, and both sides are in open warfare against one another. For now, at least, this has prevented anyone from asking the Pentagon tough questions about what its intention in the region are. Again, you got to give Turkey credit here. They are able to wage proxy wars against Russia and the U.S. simultaneously, all while being friends with Israel still. Remember, Turkey still gives 40+% of Israel's oil and gas from Azerbaijan. All of that's all provided, and the trade hasn't stopped either. Everybody's pointed this out, and there have been protests, against the Azerbaijani state oil company in Turkey that have been shut down by Turkish police. So people need to start asking these questions, especially with the prophecies in mind. We know that Erdogan is going to fall. So think about it this way. Sure, Erdogan may believe in this neo-Ottoman dream. He may even kind of sort of care about the Palestinians in the back of his mind a little bit, but we know he's not in good health. We know the Kemalists are going to take over. Let's say this year Erdogan dies. the Kemalists take over. Now there's this huge joint U.S.-Turkish wing all across Russia's southern flank, the southern Caucasus flank, across Syria, across Turkey, perhaps even into Iraq, because the Turks are always talking about going into Iraqi Kurdistan, because that's where a lot of central PKK, YPG operations exist as well. So this is very important. And then next thing you know, you have a fully pro-NATO, pro-West, anti-Russian coalition right here stretching across the Middle East. We're going to get into what's going to happen to Iran here as well, but think about how that is going to factor into a future war with Russia. If this force decides to really intervene in Ukraine, for example, if that is still continuing past 2025, which it very much appears that it will be. So these are things everybody needs to be considering, because sure, Erdogan may not like the US right now and is playing NATO against Russia and really doing his own thing, but when he goes, we know who comes in, and it's full Zog, and that's not going to be good for anybody. But before we talk about Yemen, I think this is a good time to talk about this. I mean, that Azerbaijani plane that was shot down by Russia, real quick, this is from the International. This is a piece about how Turkey was the true victor in Syria, but it flashes back to an interesting episode that people might remember paying attention back in November 2015. So I'm going to read from El País International here. The downing of a Russian Su-24 fighter jet by the Turkish Air Force in November 2015 on the Syrian border, described by Russian President Vladimir Putin as a treacherous attack, led to heightened tensions with Moscow, which retaliated with harsh economic sanctions on Ankara. Erdogan was forced to apologize 7 months later and accept Russia's dominance and the dominance of its allies in Iran and the Shiite militias on Syria's battlefields. He also agreed to submit to the Astana negotiation process overseen by Russia and Iranian support in Kazakhstan's capital, effectively sidelining the U.S.-sponsored peace talks in Geneva. So this is very relevant to what happened today. This is 9 years ago now, 10 years ago almost, but this was some of the most important developments in the Syrian civil war back in its earlier days. And now we recently saw this plane shot down, this Azerbaijani plane shot down by the Russians. And this is from the AP. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev said Sunday that the Azerbaijani airliner that crashed last week was shot down by Russia, albeit unintentionally, and criticized Moscow for trying to hush up the issue for days. And of course, eventually, this is from USA Today from December 28th, Russia's President Vladimir Putin Saturday apologized to Azerbaijan's president for a tragic incident which happened in Russia airspace involving Azerbaijan Airlines passenger plane that crashed after air defenses were used against Ukrainian drones. So what I heard was that this plane had to get diverted. It was apparently going to land in Grozny. It was flying over Kazakhstan. And then a big drone attack also hit Grozny, which has happened a few times, not very commonly in the war, but it's happened. And then air defense was activated and it ended up hitting the plane. And mind you, we're going to talk about the Korean plane crash later, which tragically killed almost everyone on board. The majority of people actually survived, I believe. 38 people killed, tragedy, of course, but it wasn't just a total destruction. But in relation, this is something that's happened specifically between Turkey and Russia, passenger planes in the past as well over Donbass. We know Strelkov is the one that's supposedly to be held internationally responsible for that Turkish passenger plane that was shot down over Donbass. We, of course, had what I explained before, the Russian jet shot down. There have been Russian planes shot down as well in the past, passenger planes. So in light of all of this, before we move on to Yemen very quickly, I mean, is this something that's going to factor into a future deterioration of relations? Or do you think that Russia, I mean, it seems that Putin was quick to apologize as the Russia-Azerbaijan alliance, and then thus the sort of de facto Russian-Turkish alliance, and then that ostensibly factoring into the Russo-Turkish, Azerbaijani-Israeli alliance. I mean, is this something that's real? And what do you think of this plane crash? Do you think it will have any long-term effect on Russo-Azerbaijani relations?
I think whatever the connection between Russo-Azeri elites, it's probably a lot deeper held. And perhaps even when Russia, for example, it didn't really pursue the Agalarov family after the Crocus City Hall disaster on Putium in 2024, when the particular shopping center in Moscow was built by these Azeri Jewish oligarchs, it wasn't really built out of the correct materials. The fire and smoke actually killed tens of people. And they didn't really pursue that. The Agalarov family ran off to Baku, to Azerbaijan. And Russia has essentially abandoned that Judeo-Islamic angle of the entire debacle of the Crocus City Hall. It was essentially completely forgotten. And even I would say, like looking at Russo-Islamic relations, which have deep ties, of course, to Turkey as the former Ottoman sponsor of Islamism in Russia. If you look at the Caucasus Wars, the so-called wars between the Circassians and the Russian Empire, Turkey was always the sponsor of Islamism in Russia, or even the Kadyrov recent support for HTS, which again, HTS is essentially a Turkish-backed Islamic oppositionary government in Syria at the moment. The fact that Kadyrov even spoke out in favor of HTS in December was very curious. It's almost as if Kadyrov, I mean, this plane was flying from Baku to Grozny, to Kadyrov's capital where Kadyrov was stationed. So the actual, if it was then shot down by air defense, as the Azerbaijani president did claim, which Putin, by the way, in his apology to the Azeri president, he didn't actually admit his guilt or the guilt of Russia. That air defense missile launcher could have been commanded or piloted by a Chechen, for example, or an Ingush. But, that's sort of neither here nor there. It just needs to be said that the Russian pivot towards, appeasing their Muslim cohabitants of the Russian Federation has been very curious across all of 2024, and it has led to almost no sort of fruits of any sort of measurable scale, besides the fact that many Chechens, Ingush, and Dagestanis are signing up and enlisting into the SMO. But again, they always have played a minority role in the Russian military armed forces. Less than 5% of the Russian army is actually composed of Muslims. So you just need to keep that in mind as well. And there's also, of course, that recent interview that came out from the Chechen oppositionary leader in Kiev. Actually, he was interviewed and he said that we're very proud that we supported HTS and that Ukraine assisted HTS in taking power in Syria, and that next we're going to come for Kadyrov and we're going to come for Putin as well. Now, keeping in mind that Ukrainian-Turkish HTS relationship, it does seem like Putin is playing with fire, sort of appeasing some of these Muslims within his own country, like kissing the Quran in August last year. Again, labeling the Krokus City Hall Tajiks as being Ukrainian agents initially, which now has been debunked by Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB. All these bizarre stories, and even the ISIS-K takeover, all these stories.
Well, yeah, you claim that these Tajiks were Ukrainians, and then meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence actually helps HTS, and we're going to recognize them? Come on.
Yeah, I know. It's contradictory, but it's supposed to be highly chaotic because, again, this is what they call hybrid warfare, right? In modern international relations at universities, they teach about hybrid warfare, but I don't think it's hybrid in nature. It's more schizophrenic, and it's also led by the fact that there's Chabad rabbis standing behind various leaders, and there's this behind-the-scenes international relations veil, which really needs to be lifted in order for us to understand exactly how these world leaders interact. But the forgiveness given by the Azeri president, I think, is not surprising, given that Azerbaijan really has the sweetest. Azerbaijan has defeated Armenia, you can say, almost twice in the last 10 years. It has gained significant ground. It hasn't spoiled its relations with Iran, its neighbor, given that Azerbaijan theoretically could be the Iranian version of Ukraine, theoretically speaking, in a future sort of front of the war. And perhaps the Azeri military, which is now heavily experienced, heavily armed by the West, it will be used in that capacity against Persia in a coming sort of 2025 plus war against Iran. Perhaps Azerbaijan will be that arm of Turkey that will assist Saudi Arabia, Israel, maybe even the United States in a future war against Iran. We have to understand that Azerbaijan really is in the sweet spot in terms of they have the Israeli Jewish support of the oligarchs, they have the support of the Turkish world. At the same time, they have very friendly relations with Russia, and they're not looking to spoil that over, say, a falling of a plane, with most people even flying economy from Baku to Grozny. It's not like these are rich oligarchs who fly private planes and they sort of crash. This is these are just casual civilians. They don't really matter to the elites of Azerbaijan. It's more of a political inconvenience if you really think about that. And not to be grotesque, but that's really how these people think about the lives of the multitudes of plebeians who die sort of at their whim and through these issues. But we also need to keep in mind Ukraine has led to these drone attacks across all of the Russian Federation's territory, has led to the agitation amongst Russians and the over-preparation perhaps of air defense missile launches. There's 2 drones that smashed into Kazan over 1,000 kilometers away from the front lines have also led to that. That's just north of the Krasnodarska Oblast, just north towards the Volga, north of the Caspian Sea. That's quite close to where you could say theoretically this trajectory of the plane was going. And so you can imagine just some Chechen or Ingush operating an air defense missile or a launcher of some sort getting a bit trigger happy, perhaps. We've seen this with the Prigozhin revolt as well, where we had Russian helicopters and Russian warplanes shot down by Prigozhin's Wagner forces. And their excuse was that, well, our anti-air defense missile Wagner launch person was simply trigger happy. So we've seen this excuse kind of used in the past. But nevertheless, I think in the greater scheme of things, Russia is trying to balance these sort of BRICS multipolar relations with its neighbors, whilst at the same time perhaps even sacrificing some of its own relations. And we know Kazakhstan is looking at this very much with a raised eyebrow. We know Tokayev is balancing Kazakhstan between Russia, China, and the US. And so Kazakhstan is a potential future Turkic front of the expanded Russian world, as Patriarch Kirill calls it, and even the potential front for complications, right? Given that the ethnic Russian population in Kazakhstan is being slightly oppressed over the last few decades in Kazakh schools, is sort of amongst Kazakh culture as the Turkification of the Kazakh people kind of expands. we do have to keep in mind that the fact that the plane even crashed on Kazakh territory made the Kazakhstan airport look bad. Now there's almost like this curse of death sort of flying over Kazakhstan. People are not looking at the particular area of the Caspian Sea as safe. This is all, of course, going to play into the larger Kazakh-Russian relations, which I think will deteriorate over the next coming decade. Potentially, even if a Turkish belt does not come into fruition and Erdogan falls, and again, the focus shifts to more of a Turkey-Greek East Mediterranean focus and kind of shifts away from Central Asia, which is quite a chaotic place to begin with, right? Looking at Pakistan, Afghanistan. I mean, Russia recognizing the Taliban seems to be also a move of recent sort of foreign political, I would say, appeasement of these Islamists, right? Because they do want to make peace with some of these people even coming over the border of Kazakhstan, which is quite large of Russia. So I think overall, the sort of forgiveness that Aliyev has sent to Moscow is a handshake of peace between, I think, elites of both countries. And it's really, unfortunately, less about a focus on the actual lives lost and more about a focus of keeping the status quo, which I think the Azeri elites are very happy with, given their position in modern world affairs and in the Middle East at large.
I think you're very right that the future Kemalist leaders of Turkey will actually want to refocus towards Greece and Cyprus and the Balkans as opposed to Central Asia, because they don't want this big increase in these ethnic Turkic Islamists, these Uyghurs, these Turkmens, these Tajiks, these people that are much harder core Islamists than what these Kemalists, these Turkish nationalists would want. They would much rather be doing Western irredentism and trying to, at the same time, ingratiate themselves with more Western values. So that's very true. But before I move on to Lebanon here really quickly, Dimitri, did I hear you correctly that you're going on the record saying Persian-Israeli-US war 2025?
Yeah, I've actually listened to some analysis from Russian sort of foreign policy commentators and people who dabble in international relations. And there is this really broad view that the anti-Iranian rhetoric, of course, from people like the future Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as Donald J. Trump, even trying to blame the various assassination attempts on Iranian proxies within the US. And again, the sort of closeness between Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald J. Trump, and sort of the expansion of Israel, the fall of the Syrian government, which was very pro-Iranian. It does lead me to this unfortunate conclusion that 2025 we will see a lot of very heavy moves against Persia, Iran, and again, the axis of resistance, which Iran is a great sponsor of. Again, at the end of the day, I think that the Shia axis, as you've said correctly, Conrad, is a much greater force that has been opposing Zionism in Israel rather than even the Muslim Brotherhood, even with its branch of Hamas. In many ways, of course, we see this with Ansar Allah, the Houthis, and of course, Hezbollah and the Hezbollah, the Lebanese war, which was a major sort of story of 2024 against Israel. But specifically, it was Shamil Beno, a foreign policy analyst, a former leader of Chechen politics, and who also collaborated with the KGB at the end of the USSR. He actually came out with this very interesting summary of 2025 in terms of, he stated very openly that in 2025, around March, April at the earliest, and perhaps even the middle of summer, so June, July, August, there will be a coalitionary strike between Israel, the US, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia against Iran. So essentially open war will be declared against Iran, and they will essentially blame Iran for terror strikes across the Middle East. We see that sort of rhetoric rising now, again, when we speak about America and what has taken place with ISIS. Unfortunately, the average consumer of American media doesn't really necessarily tell various Islamists apart. They see ISIS and they think, oh, well, it's just violent Muslims being extremists and fundamentalists, when they don't realize Iran is also and has been at war with ISIS since ISIS even came into existence to begin with, right? With Soleimani and all these other generals. But Shamil Beno made the very apt prediction that this year, 2025, we'll see, of course, with Trump coming to the presidency, his support for Benjamin Netanyahu, again, his close relations with MBS and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it will be very dangerous for Iran, which has seemingly not just abandoned President Assad and allow that regime to essentially collapse and fall, which I don't necessarily blame them for, but there is that angle there that Iran has essentially tried to distance themselves and not even retaliated for those Israeli strikes at the end of 2024. Iran can also feel the heat and the feel that when Donald J. Trump does come to power, that potentially they will be the next target of this sort of globalist strike. And potentially we will be seeing a hot war this year, and it'll be much worse and perhaps much longer, because Iran is twice the size of Iraq in terms of population, in terms of land mass, and in terms of actual preparation. It does have Russian technology. It has real S-400 anti-air missile systems that Turkey also has. and that allegedly were given to Assad in Syria, but we found out that that was essentially fake news being spread by pro-Russian media sources, and the Assad regime really fell without taking down any Israeli Air Force planes. We know Iran is preparing for a proper war, and I think they're also quite scared. I can't necessarily blame Khamenei or the Pezeshkian government, which is very much like a Gorbachev perestroika type of government. I think some people are even saying that the Armenian background Dr. Pezeshkian is a more, shall we say, lightweight, liberal Iranian president who's trying to move Iran away from this regional war. He's trying to save the country from bleeding out in this future US-Israeli conflict. But again, the ball is in Israel and President Donald J. Trump's court. And so I think Donald J. Trump, who has the mandate of the people, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who essentially at the moment is being prosecuted for his crimes in Israel and in international courts as well, they're seemingly going to take this opportunity. And I think, as Shamil Beno correctly predicted, there will be a war against Iran, I believe, in 2025. Hopefully my prediction is wrong, but I think regionally speaking, we are seeing essentially the bullseye hanging over the Persian landmass. And again, this will cause such strife in the area that will essentially move us into this World War III Armageddon stage that, of course, the prophecies speak about very openly.
Well, I'm here to talk about Lebanon, and it unfortunately points right in that direction of this 2025 war that you were talking about. And of course, Pezeshkian, you just talked about Azerbaijan and how they've been ascending much with their Turkish brother this year, kind of coming out as a winner. Pezeshkian, of course, half Kurdish, half Azeri, and he is, I believe, in some capacity behind the scenes, very much at odds with the hardliners in the IRGC and the Ayatollah himself. We know that Iran is experiencing these power issues, these energy issues, despite being such an energy-rich country. And Pezeshkian even came out to the media and said, when I was meeting with the Ayatollah in the palace, I noticed that half of the lights everywhere were off. And I'm like, why are you reporting this to the media? It sounded like he was trying to make the situation sound bad, make the Ayatollah sound bad. And, maybe that was just the reporting from the English language source that I was reading. But again, it seems that I would say it's Pezeshkian and his government that are the ones that are insisting that there's no retaliation on Israel for what we actually have talked about in the past could have been a strike on a nuclear research facility that went very underreported by Iranian and Western media, that came in response to the huge, big shock and awe sort of strikes on the air bases that, everyone still posts the pictures of Iran, when they struck Israel for real that one time. So, but as we move on to what's going on in Lebanon, this points in the direction of the decline of the Axis. Unfortunately, this is from the Israeli Broadcasting Authority. Israel is expected to convey a message to the U.S. that it will not withdraw from southern Lebanon after the 60-day period stipulated in the ceasefire agreement. That's, of course, the ceasefire with Hezbollah that talks about Hezbollah withdrawing north of the Litani River, the Lebanese army coming in, taking over all of that region, Israeli army withdrawing to the Israeli border south. And then, of course, in response to this, Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem, he said, there is no timetable that determines the performance of the resistance, neither by agreement nor after the end of the 60 days. Our patience may run out before the 60 days or it may continue. The resistance leadership decides. When we decide what we will do, we will see it live. So they're also seemingly implying that they're not going to necessarily withdraw from their areas, and even before the 60 days, they may start striking Israeli forces again. And this is from antiwar.com, continuing this trend. Israel's military continued its invasion of southern Lebanon today, despite the 60-day ceasefire in place during which it's meant to vacate the country. The village of Beit Leaf was the latest target, with Israeli Merkava tanks and military bulldozers arriving at the outskirts of town and shelling the area. Israeli troops armed with machine guns also invaded the neighboring towns of Yatir and Ramiyeh. These towns and villages aren't far from the Israeli border, but were not occupied at the time of the ceasefire. Israel has taken multiple villages in different parts of southern Lebanon since the ceasefire began and has withdrawn from only a handful. The ceasefire was meant to see Israeli troops leave the occupied towns and Lebanese forces replace them. Lebanese troops are showing up in towns like Shama and Al-Baida, however, and are reporting that Israel has razed multiple neighborhoods to the ground. There have been persistent reports of Israeli bulldozers leveling civilian homes across southern Lebanon, but it is only with the arrival of Lebanese forces in those areas that we see what is actually left there. Bulldozing homes for weeks after the ceasefire, the reality is that there isn't much left. While it can be definitely stated that the newly invaded towns and villages are going to face the same demolition, the bulldozers are present, and Israel has been stepping up the bulldozing of homes and infrastructure wherever it goes. Israel has made a point of warning civilians against trying to return to their homes all across a band of southern Lebanon, and these newly invaded towns are inside that zone. Many Lebanese have been displaced throughout the war, and many are trying to return home after almost 40 days of quote-unquote ceasefire, despite the warnings against doing so. And again, people have to realize still huge strikes going on in Gaza, more discussions ramping up about settlements in Gaza. So they're going in both directions here, north, south, and, east towards the West Bank with more and more talk of settlements there for Bezalel Smotrich. But as we can see, despite Turkey ascending in its neo-Ottoman expansion, Israel is expanding in Lebanon, expanding into Syria, and expanding into Palestine. So who's really winning here, right? And obviously, as usual, it is Zog. And the unfortunate reality as well is that they're ramping up the pressure on who we viewed as the most effective, despite their far distance from Israel, the most effective Iranian axis of resistance proxy, which are the Ansar Allah Yemeni Houthis, who, despite huge joint strikes from the US, the UK, and Israel, you're almost losing count how many have hit Sana'a, Hodeida, Hodeida, all these other places across, the smaller region of Yemen that the Houthis occupy. They continue to launch ballistic missiles at Israel, and they continue to get through the Iron Dome. It's frankly just impressive. You have to say it like that. And there's even recent claims that the Houthis shot down an MQ-9 Reaper drone in the past 3 days. That was on January 1st, I believe. The fact of the matter is that everybody's having to ramp up the pressure, and the UAE and the Saudi-backed proxies that occupy, the southern and eastern areas of Yemen, outside of the major populated areas around Sana'a. Obviously, all of Western Yemen is where the Houthis have their control and have to control the Red Sea coast, and that's how they've been able to bring the Suez Canal to a near halt and have been able to very much impact Israel's situation for what they've been able to do. Both of those backed groups, the Saudi and UAE backed groups, have been ramping up their attacks and bombings and everything, but the Houthis are going on the offensive. They are actually taking towns that they didn't even have before all of this stuff happened after October 7th, and they're expanding into these other territories. So we might be seeing the beginning of the Yemeni civil war, or part 2 of the Yemeni civil war. And I think, unfortunately, that factors very much into your prediction, Dimitri, because if the Yemeni civil war kicks up again, then that's it for Iranian-Saudi relations. And I could very much see Saudi Arabia going right back to the Abraham Accords and normalizing with Israel if it would help them get the Houthis and therefore get back at Iran. And I fear that is what's coming. And to confirm that even more, this is from Anti-War as well. Tel Aviv is planning to increase its funding for global propaganda efforts by 20 times. The surge in spending comes as Israel's public image is sagging around the world over the onslaught in Gaza. A new budget for the Israeli Foreign Ministry includes $150 million for what Israel calls Hasbara, or consciousness warfare. According to the Times of Israel, the new budget is a 20-fold increase from the previous spending level. So if we're going to see a big push here to push all of Israel's enemies, again, we're seeing Lebanon, they're staying. We're seeing Syria, they're annexing. We're seeing Gaza and the West Bank, they're winning. And it appears that even the Houthis now, despite being so strong, might be facing an insurmountable loss. But, this is from Telegraph. They say that the Houthis growing stronger through new Iranian supplies. Mm-hmm. So I think this is just from today. So perhaps this is part of that intelligence warfare that Israel was talking about, trying to convince people to support them more against the Houthis. But it would make sense that Iran would continue to beef them up in Yemen, considering that they've lost Assad in Syria. They seem to be losing Hezbollah. The Iraqi militias are facing pressure. Israel, just in the past 2 days, Israel Katz, Gideon Sa'ar, Netanyahu have all been issuing warnings to Iraq, saying they need to disband the popular mobilization forces, get the Shia militias off their border, or else they say that Iraq will face the same fate as Syria. So they're just openly doing Greater Israel right now, threatening all of their enemies, making the map look exactly how it needs to. So if I were Iran, I would definitely be beefing up the Houthis, because they have proven that they can handle it. They've proven they can maintain frame, that they can keep their territory despite multiple proxies trying to get in on them. They've been able to maintain frame despite strikes from the US, the UK, France. They've done the blockades. So as far as reliable proxies go, they seem to be the number one. So if Iran is hoping to maintain any kind of relevance, and if, as Dimitri predicted, this future Saudi, Israeli, US strike, I think the Houthis are going to be a valuable ally. But unless you have anything else to say about what's going on in the Middle East, Gaza, Yemen, the West Bank, Lebanon, we definitely need to move on to some of these election issues in Europe, because, of course, it's a big issue. It was a big issue in Germany, whether they were even going to send their delegation to Syria to talk to the HTS and everything. It's a big issue, of course, in Georgia, what's going on, because we talked about Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Turkish belt forming. Fortunately for Russia, Georgia seems to be successfully drifting back into the Russian sphere of influence, which would give it a very valuable buffer against this developing Turkish belt. And we know that the prophecies of Saint Philomenos and Saint Gabriel Ergabadze of Georgia talk about the Russian troops marching through Georgia easily into Syria and into Turkey to wage war against the Turks there. So what exactly is going on in Georgia as we talk about some of these other elections? We're going to get into Romania, Germany as well, but Georgia specifically, is this color revolution over? We know that on December 29th, that was when the new president took office and Zurabashvili would have had to be gone. What exactly is going on there?
Yeah, it does seem like the Georgian people have cemented themselves not just through their parliamentary elections, but also the presidential elections. Now that just a week ago, Mikhail Kavelashvili has been elected and blessed even by the patriarch of Tbilisi and all of Georgia, Ilya. Now he's in his 90s, I believe. So very old. One of the oldest serving patriarch of the Orthodox Christian Church has already blessed the new conservative governor of Georgia. So we understand the Orthodox Church of Georgia really has taken an unequivocal stance that it does not stand with the sort of EU liberal opposition that has been, of course, mounting protests across Tbilisi over the last, I would say, more than 40 days at this point, like since November at least of 2024. So it's been quite intense. But Zurabashvili has essentially Salome Zurabashvili, a joint citizen. She's the president of, again, the former president of Georgia, who at one point was supported by the Georgian Dream Party, funny enough, when she first became a president. Again, this is a bad omen for women in politics and women presidents in general, because we have seen them underperform, generally speaking, across all of Europe and the Middle East. So again, what does that exactly say about women participating in electoral politics? I think it sends a really unequivocal message that really, perhaps, despite the fact that no matter how based any right-wing woman should be, even in like a Georgian context, in the end, they all seem to be supportive of some sort of globalist agenda behind the scenes. But Zurabashvili, she's somewhat gone into hiding, essentially. There's been no main news reports of her over the last 5 to 6 days. There is a theory that she's still in Tbilisi. Perhaps she'll be granted, if she does, step down, and if she does announce that she's no longer the president, because again, there is actually a sworn-in president at the moment. He's also blessed by the Orthodox Christian Church there, that she will, remain in Georgia and will not go to her homeland of France, where her particular ancestry is from. These are Georgian liberals, by the way, who, after the Russian Revolution, when Georgia essentially illegally disconnected itself from the Russian Empire, which was falling apart, a liberal Masonic government took power in Georgia before the Bolsheviks, of course, invaded Georgia as well and took power there. And these liberal Freemasonic Georgians, a lot of them actually moved to France, sort of like as white emigres, you could say, white refugees. And this is the sort of stock that Zurabashvili comes from. So essentially, it's not like that she's an Orthodox Christian refugee of some sort. Her ancestry is very sort of clinically speaking, liberal and Masonic, which is why she supports the EU, LGBTQ rights, and all these other things. But Georgia seemingly has saved itself from the fate of many other European countries. Frankly, the most important nation, of course, we're looking at and that we're quite critical of, especially its government, is Greece, which has really fallen. I think 2024 has been one of the worst years for Greece, the legalization of gay marriage, etc., the agitation against Turkey and sort of a coming war, and the purchasing of F-35 planes, which I think for Greece has been a good idea. But mind you, the purchase of these warplanes, Conrad, has been done for credit from the US, the IMF, and essentially these Rothschilds-backed loan sharks, right, from the globalist side. So whether or not that's a good idea, hopefully it does serve the people of Greece in sort of securing their sovereignty into the future, even after this liberal government hopefully is ousted from Greece. Maybe even these F-35 planes will serve the future awakened Marble King, who we covered in our episode with Gregory Hears. Hopefully, like that is the vision I think we all have for a based Orthodox Greece. And moving into the future, I think Russia reestablishing good relations with its, I would say, second Orthodox Christian country, because Russia and Belarus, of course, very deeply Orthodox countries. Russia had bad relations with every other Orthodox nation on earth, simply because the other countries were deeply aligned with the West, the NATO, the EU. And now Georgia will be that third, well, technically that second country that Russia will have a growing tied relationship with. And again, Russia reestablishes itself on the other side of the Caucasus Mountains. This is also a massive, again, move towards a potential front where Russia could, if the relationship becomes closer and stronger with the new Georgian Dream Party, perhaps Russia could even establish itself militarily in Georgia to assist the Georgian military, to alleviate the need for Georgia to spend heavily on their military budget, and maybe even the Georgian people, generally speaking. They've always served. I mean, just remember General Bagration during the War of 1812, one of the leaders of the Russian military, of the Russian Empire, who fought against Napoleon during those wars. The Georgian aristocracy always served their Orthodox Christian brothers in the north very loyally and very very adequately. So again, the Russian-Georgian relations going forward, I think, is one of the highlights of the end of this year. And on the other side of the Black Sea, again, if we're looking at another Orthodox nation with which the situation has somewhat worsened, again, the presidential election, the first round of elections has been declared to be illegitimate by the High Court of Romania. Calin Georgescu, a very based right-wing Romanian presidential candidate who was winning the election during the first round. That particular election was postponed, now officially, Conrad, to April of 2025. So we have some new key dates that we need to look out for. Essentially, just before Easter, I believe, this year, there'll be a really massive move for an election that will be, I would say, country-defining in Romania. But just notice how in Georgia, for example, the Georgian Dream Party officially announced very early on during their elections that the Orthodox Church supports them in particular, and you had Georgian hierarchs stand up with the right-wing party of the Georgian Dream. In Romania, Patriarch Daniel, who has been Patriarch since 2007, so technically even longer than Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and Russia, Patriarch Daniel in Romania has already announced that the Orthodox Christian clergy there should not participate and should not have any views on election whatsoever. I think that's a key point we need to keep reiterating, because Romania, as a very populated and very potentially right, in a futuristic sense, a very right-wing Orthodox country that could define the future of Eastern Europe, is facing some civilizationally defining elections. And unfortunately, the Orthodox Church is going to take a back seat. And hopefully their position changes. But we know Patriarch Daniel, he's been very conservative and he's been very, shall we say, not disposed to causing any tensions in this post-Eastern Soviet bloc country of Romania. So it's quite curious as exactly where Calin Georgescu will go, if he's going to re-emphasize his stance on orthodoxy, if he's going to be promoting these protests in his own favor. I'm sure his electoral campaign is going to promote all kinds of statements, maybe even against the EU, for sort of right-wing conservative values, or will he re-emphasize the fact that Romania will remain a loyal NATO country that will serve the greater interests of a united Europe, which I think would be unfortunate, but maybe that he'll do that in order to win his future seat as the president of Romania. We'll see what kind of deals he goes for here. But he's in a very tough situation at the moment because Calin Georgescu is one of the upcoming, say, neo-Codreanu figures in Romanian politics. But again, people are skeptical of whether or not he will ever be allowed to run as a president, or even if he'll ever be. In many ways, he's even more controversial than, say, even a Donald J. Trump in America, because he's bringing back some of the values which have been ostracized and pushed back by the globalist and Talmudic forces that have taken over Romania since the end of the Second World War. So he's making some big changes. I think his appearance on the arena of Eastern European politics, I think, is one of the most surprising things of the end of last year.
And he's appealing to the ECHR. I'm going to read from that really quick, but quick on Georgia. The U.S. has already sanctioned Georgian Dream Party founder, one of the main, people might call him oligarchs of Georgia, Bedzina Ivanishvili, for, quote, undermining the democratic and Euro-Atlantic future of Georgia in favor of the Russian Federation. So not really hiding the motivation there in any way, shape, or form. And of course, Mikhail Kavalashvili, the new president who replaced Zurabashvili, he is signing dozens of laws very quickly, being accused of signing repressive laws that they're giving the police the power to do what they need to do to put this protest down. And I believe some of them are going to not be good for Zurabashvili, because she should be arrested at this point. She's fomenting revolution against the Georgian state. But at the same time, the prime minister of Georgia, the person with the real power, the politician at least, Irakli Kobakidze, of course, also of the Georgian Dream Party, he openly is saying that resetting relations with the U.S. will depend on the end of the war in Ukraine. So not only is Georgia drifting directly into the Russian sphere of influence, but they're just openly calling for the end of Western support for Ukraine, and I think by definition a Russian victory, because they're addressing the U.S. when they say this, which I think is very interesting. And of course, in response to all of this, German and EU officials have said that they are completely withdrawing EU candidacy, and that EU officials need to go there to try to do something. I don't know exactly what that means, but the full shift of Georgia from one of the potential new Atlanticist EU holdouts in the far, far east of that jurisdiction's, claimed, or rather that organization's claimed jurisdiction, has shifted hard back towards Russia, which is, I think, a very positive development. But as far as Georgescu, he has been posting on X about his appeal to the ECHR. This is from Romania Insider. Right-wing politician and former presidential candidate Calin Georgescu announced in a message on X that he will appeal the annulment of the Romanian presidential elections before the European Court of Human Rights. On December 6, 2024, as Romanians abroad had already begun to vote, Romania's constitutional court unanimously annulled the entire presidential election process, citing declassified reports alleging Russian involvement in cyber activities aimed at undermining the integrity of the electoral process. The presidential election process started with the first round on November 24th, which ended with the surprise win of EU-skeptic ultranationalist independent candidate Calin Georgescu and reformist U.S. SAR leader Elena Lesconi in second place. Now they have to start from scratch, reportedly at the end of March. This is from Georgescu. If Romanian justice is not broad justice and honor to the Romanian people, then perhaps the international justice system from the ECHR will do so for the good of all. Justice exists so that people no longer have to take justice into their own hands, provided that their fundamental constitutional rights are protected. So I don't know if that's a veiled threat to, rise up. But of course, this article goes on to say that he benefited from this Chinese, Russian TikTok thing. But the only evidence for any of the stuff, even the pro-Georgescu stuff, proves that it was paid for by groups that are backed by the current president of Romania that is very anti-Georgescu. So it's total nonsense. And we've seen up to 5,000 people taking to the streets of Bucharest and these other areas to protest in favor of Georgescu. And over 5,000 people, I mean, that's very big for a non-astroturfed protest here in the middle of January when it is very cold. So, it's good to see that. Unfortunately, I'm sure they're just going to rig the elections the next time and make sure this doesn't happen, because we know that they're very capable of doing that. But speaking of other elections that they're definitely going to try to rig, we have news on these new German elections. They will be held on February 23rd in 2025. They were supposed to be held in September, but the Olaf Scholz government is indeed collapsing. And this will be the fourth snap elections that have to be called in post-war German history. So it's a big deal. And obviously it's going to be a big deal because the AfD poses to become, I think at the very least, I don't think there's any way they don't become the second largest party in Germany, which is something that is going to be a huge shakeup. I think there's a chance, without any shenanigans at least, that they become the largest party. And of course, we know that the center-right party, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, they are very much opposed to any kind of alliance with the AfD. So what we will likely see is a huge coalition formed of every party against the AfD. But ultimately, I think on the long enough time frame that will backfire, because German people want solutions to mass migration and whatnot, and don't want to see every other party uniting against the one party that offers solutions like remigration and things that will lead to, there were just terrorist attacks very recently at these German Christmas markets, and Alice Weidel, the lesbian leader of the AfD, she was, crying, talking about this attack. So I'm sure they'll have good propaganda going into this election, but we have to make sure that they do well, and that, the Bjorn Haka wing, the true nationalists in the AfD, do well. And at the same time, the Austrian left-wing chancellor has quit as any kind of coalition. They were trying to do what I just described in Austria, to form a huge big tent coalition against the Austrian Freedom Party, the FPO. And this chancellor, he's, the Conservative People's Party. They had tried to form a coalition with the Social Democrats, and it just couldn't happen. So the far right, as they call them, the FPO, who had won a big victory in September, they are now going to be able to take power, which they have in the past, and they are considered Russia-friendly and all of that. So good developments in the Germanic world as far as, I think, election potentials go. We have to pray for the Germans because it's getting very bad there. But I think it's starting to get to the point where we can really say that Germany is better than the UK, because we're going to talk about that in a second. And it's just brutal because the whole Rotterdam stuff coming out. But before that, we have to talk about Poland, because I want to hear your thoughts on this, Dimitri. They are building a big road to Kaliningrad, supposedly for rapid troop deployment. And this is from MSN. Poland's Deputy Minister for Migration, Maciej, I'm not even going to try to read this Polish name, Maciej D, said in an interview with the Financial Times that Poland would soon build a road to the border with the Kaliningrad region of Russia. With this road, Polish troops will be able to respond more quickly to possible security breaches. Poland intends to complete the construction of the border wall, and close the border with Belarus by next summer. This is a necessary measure to stop the influx of migrants, which Warsaw calls Russia's hybrid war. In the coming months, Warsaw will build a new road towards Kaliningrad, and it talks more about what they're going to do on the border with Belarus, and they consider that not just the Polish border, but the EU border. So I'm wondering your thoughts, of course, on any of these elections, Dimitri, but specifically here on Poland as well, because we know that Poland is kind of how so many of the Western weapons get into Russia and Ukraine, it's a pretty good way to transition to that conflict here.
No, absolutely. I think Poland is, again, it will be used if its politicians are not careful enough. And we did see, the blowing out of the Hanukkah candles in 2023 and by the Polish member of parliament. But Poland itself, like a very theoretically conservative country, the most Roman Catholic country besides Italy in terms of their allegiance to the Pope. They use Catholicism as their sort of defining element of their nation. And yet we do see Poland very much aligning with this sort of NATO conglomeration against Russia and against sort of the rise of, I would say, real Christian conservatism in the East, and especially in its sort of, with sort of anti-Semitic connotations going on there. But in Poland, some very bad news, not just the construction of that massive highway, and we have seen like the fall of Aleppo, Idlib, the highway leading down to Damascus, Homs, etc. Highways play a very key role in terms of exactly how troops and heavy armor can be moved very rapidly through sort of terrain. We also saw that with the Prigozhin revolt in June of 2023. So we know highways and just roads being constructed, roads that actually work, function, are a sort of key element of modern warfare. It's not just all off-road. Particular highways, freeways play a very key role. And again, this could also be a reason as to why Russia's seeing this particular construction take place, putting Kaliningrad, former Königsberg of Prussia, under risk. It could also play a role in sort of the agitation between Russia, Belarus, and Poland in terms of even the granting of like the 10 or so Oryshnik missiles, as well as their launches to President Alexander Lukashenko earlier in December, which was announced. Lukashenko will be able to station these Oryshnik missile launches, which could fly up to a range of 1,000 kilometers anywhere in Europe, in Belarus, therefore moving the Oryshnik launch bases away from, say, the Caspian Sea and actual Russian territory deeper into Europe. I mean, this is a clear statement of sovereignty and the fact that Russia is looking to protect Kaliningrad, its sort of winnings after the Second World War. Now that we're officially 2025 is the 80-year anniversary of the end of that Second World War, which I think surely in May will be celebrated quite triumphantly in Moscow, hopefully together with many more modern victories in the SMO. But the other update from Poland, Conrad, is the massive cargo ships which have arrived from the US. And again, these cargo ships were carrying US military vehicles. We know that for sure. They've arrived at Gdansk and Gdynia in Poland. These are two major port cities located on the Baltic Sea. And these ships were so large that, carrying massive crates, and each one of these ships could carry up to 1,000 vehicles. So again, tanks, military jeeps, all kinds of equipment for Ukraine. That is the supposition. Again, their cargo is top secret, but as we can assume, it's most likely elements of those Biden aid packages that were given over to Ukraine during his presidency. They have arrived in Poland. They're going to be making their way by train to the Ukrainian front lines, and again, being served in terms of exactly how Ukraine will be preparing their future counteroffensives this year, which Zelensky has already said, together with a new wave of mobilization that will be taking place this year. So there's some optimism, I guess, for the globalists and for the pro-Ukrainian forces that Poland is still very much participating in this conflict, despite the fact that the country is immigrant-free, it's allegedly terrorist-free as well. At the same time, it's still participating as this massive cogwheel in the mechanism of Zog and in the perpetration of this conflict against the real sort of Christian revivalism across Europe. With the fall of Ukraine, I think many of these things will be highlighted, especially if Russia achieves the proper victory, which it should move towards not just the securing of these 4 constitutional zones in Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk. So very interesting how Poland is still being used as this secondary battering ram, as a sort of element of US foreign policy in Europe. It's quite sad as well, and shows you that despite, no matter how based you are, if your foreign policy is not aware of like the Talmudic influence over world affairs, over European history, and even Poland stating that Benjamin Netanyahu can't visit for the Auschwitz memorial in May of this year, the liberation of Auschwitz, for example, that particular 80-year anniversary. Despite all of these things, we have to keep our eye sort of on the realpolitik angle, is that Poland still serves as this major player in the vanguard of NATO against the Russian Federation and against a rise of, say, conservative Christianity in Eastern Europe. So it's quite a realist, a very maybe harsh take, but I think we just need to kind of not put on any rose-colored glasses and keep things somewhat conservative in our estimates as to where exactly the revival in Eastern Europe will come from. And alternatively, right, Conrad, moving to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the largest story of the last fortnight, and this is despite the fact that we've had drones flying, there's the St. Petersburg airport over the last 24 hours has been shut down in Russia because drones, mind you, St. Petersburg, Leningradskaya Oblast, it's located all the way up north next to Estonia. Allegedly, a Ukrainian drone tried to crash into the Russian airport over there. Now, theoretically, those drones could have flown from the territory of Estonia, again, bringing into play some of these Baltic countries with their highly anti-Orthodox and anti-Russian stances. The Russians haven't announced exactly where these military drones of Ukrainian origin have come from, but crashing into or being shot down over the Leningrad Oblast, aiming for the airports there, that's quite far away from the front lines if you get where I'm going. But we did see in the Tverskaya Oblast last year also the huge Russian arms depot being exploding, essentially causing a nuclear blast type of explosion there. So we know Ukrainian drones have been developing and their pilots have been getting very good at getting these drones into very sensitive areas across the Russian Federation, which is quite unfortunate. But as I said, the main story is the shutting down of the gas pipeline running across Ukraine into Europe. So that's the Gazprom, Brotherhood and Soyuz gas pipelines, which have been transiting gas from the Russian Federation through Ukraine and thus also powering Ukrainian homes as well as they pass into Eastern and Central Europe. Again, providing energy to some of these very key countries such as Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. The Prime Minister Robert Fico actually responded. Recall, he did visit Putin at the end of December last year, and Zelensky actually accused Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, who was, by the way, he survived an assassination attempt in May of 2024, again by a pro-Ukrainian, some sort of crazed patsy in his own capital city. Robert Fico openly stated that if Zelensky does not renew this new gas treaty with Russia to get Russian gas into Europe through Ukraine, because again, it was Ukraine who denied the extension of the gas deal, which expired on the 1st of January, Fico said that Slovakia will not be providing any emergency energy needs back to Ukraine from any other sources. And again, Zelensky accused Fico of working for Putin, so that's quite curious. I think the unfortunate part of this particular story, Conrad, is that, well, technically Russia should have shut down all gas transits into Europe at the beginning of the SMO, especially through Ukraine. Once it became very clear that these European NATO countries were supporting Ukraine in terms of arms shipments, they should have shut the gas down very early on. That probably would have ended the SMO and this ongoing very bloody war a lot sooner than what's happening at the moment as we're reaching this almost 3-year mark of the conflict in February of this year. I think it's just curious that it was Zelensky and his government who actually made that conscientious decision that they're willing to starve Europe and these maybe even pro-Russian regimes in Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary of gas in order for Russia to be economically hit, because we have to recall Gazprom is one of the most prolific gas companies, sort of that adds to the Russian budget, thus, again, increasing Russian military capacity. So Zelensky's choice, the ball was in his court. He could have extended the gas deal. He chose to, again, neglect it, and thus hypothetically negatively affecting the Russian budget and the Russian economy going forward. So it's very interesting that Zelensky was a lot braver than, say, members of the United Russia Party in sort of making that first gas geopolitical move. And we have to look also at the fact that the gas metering station in Sudzha in Kursk is still under Ukrainian occupation. The front lines in Kursk haven't moved all too much. And the greatest sort of movements at the moment is, of course, the Russian forces are progressing in the Donetsk Oblast. This is sort of the highlights of 2024. We recall in the Donetsk Oblast, this is where most of the updates of last year can be sort of summarized as Russia taking sort of mid-sized settlements and cities of Avdiivka, Seledovo, Ugledar, and Kurakhova. All 4 of these settlements were at their peak, as large as 30,000 people lived in each one of them. And these are the 4 main cities which Russia took, along with maybe 100 to 200 smaller villages, most of which were abandoned at the time. Now the Russian forces are approaching this next major city, which had as many as 60,000 people at its peak. Ukraine at the moment stated that there are only 11,000 people residing there. This is, of course, Pokrovsk. Now that the Russians have reached the main freeway leading into Pokrovsk, and you mentioned, Conrad, off air as well, that the Russians have captured just south of Pokrovsk, the closest settlement village. The Russians have established themselves to have a bridgehead in order to enter this big city and perhaps begin one of the biggest sieges that we've seen throughout the war. It's just the question is exactly how have the Ukrainians reinforced the city of Pokrovsk. Mind you, the Pokrovsk as a city has changed names many times. It hasn't. Pokrovsk today has very sort of interesting connotations. It's obviously named after the intercession of the Theotokos in some ways by modern Ukrainians, but the town was called Grishina during the Russian Empire. And of course, the Soviet Bolsheviks renamed the town to Krasnoarmeysk, which means essentially it's named after the Red Army set up by Leon Trotsky during the Civil War. What's curious is the Russian pro-Soviets and the sort of MAGA communist-aligned communist Russians are stating that when Russia does take Pokrovsk, they're going to rename it not back to Grishina, as it was during the Russian Empire when the city was Orthodox, but we're going to rename it to Krasnoarmeysk, just like Bakhmut, which was the original name of the city, was, at least on some Russian telegram channels and some maps, was renamed to Artyomovsk, named after a Bolshevik named Artyom. So again, you have these clash of culture, even in the Russian Federation, where the Bolsheviks try to assert themselves as this, well, the modern Bolsheviks and the communists try to assert themselves as the true liberators in a war against NATO, sort of reinvigorating these Cold War myths, unfortunately, when in reality they should be promoting a sort of clash of civilizations type vision that Patriarch Kirill spoke about, this war against Satanism, a clash against the degeneracy, liberalism, and a liberation of Orthodox Christian peoples across Ukraine, and even the Orthodox Christians being persecuted at the moment all across the country. So generally speaking, some of the analysts in the West have stated that Russia, just over 2024, has only recaptured 1% at most of Ukrainian territory, making some progress in Zaporozhye, quite a bit of progress in Donetsk, as we've just mentioned, Donetsk Oblast, and again, losing territory in Kursk, which the Ukrainians still hold to this day. You mentioned, Conrad, earlier that Ukraine is potentially preparing another counteroffensive somewhere, either in Bryansk Oblast, maybe supporting the Kursk offensive bridgehead that they've created inside of the Russian oblast, or maybe even going to attack Belgorod. There is an amassing of Ukrainian troops in these particular areas adjacent to the Russian border. Russians are also moving troops up north, closer to Belarus, in order to try and perhaps even guesstimate where exactly Ukraine will strike next. So the war is far from over, and all these various peace talks, which have been discussed theoretically over the last few months, they've really amounted to nothing. And I think perhaps we'll even see a further Ukrainian offensive, maybe a strike against Bryansk or Belgorod just before the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump. Because again, when the Donald J. Trump, he stated that he'll end the war in 24 hours or something. He'll have a peace. He'll have everybody sit down at the table. I think Zelensky and his government, they really want a sort of guaranteed slice of the pie in terms of exactly what leverage they will have over Russia in these coming organized peace talks by the US. And all of this is being, while we're discussing this, the Biden administration has, again, guaranteed another $1.25 billion worth of equipment, mostly like small arms, accessories, and all kinds of other munitions for Ukraine, which, again, will be provided to Ukraine through these shipping ports in Poland. So the Ukraine is still being funded by the US, still being funded by the US taxpayer dollars. And again, by the inflation which you're currently experiencing, Conrad, in America is also thanks to the fact that the US is taking on more debt in order to pay off some of these foreign expeditions and proxy wars that are taking place in Europe, killing Orthodox Christians. So it's very unfortunate where exactly the sort of Zog-occupied American government has taken the world. But in Ukraine today, at the moment, we are looking at a potential siege of Pokrovsk within the next 2 weeks by the Russians, and potentially a counterstrike by Ukraine into one of these Russian oblasts. So again, maybe a similar situation to Kursk. Hopefully the Russians are prepared, because just like in the Kursk Oblast, when the Ukrainians entered, they took many hostages, many of which are still in Ukrainian POW prisons, concentration camps somewhere to the west, potentially in central Ukraine. The Russians have not returned all of their prisoners and even civilians that the Ukrainians have shipped off. These are native Russians who they've taken from Kursk, and they've placed them in prisons all across Ukrainian territory. This is, again, a huge strike of demoralization against Russia in 2024. And we just have to conclude that Russia was not the most, the taking of Avdiivka was, I think, a huge victory, Kurakhova, etc., Ugledar, the most famous Ugledar next to Bakhmut. But 2024 was not a major successful period for the state of the Russian Federation in the SMO. Hopefully in 2025, they'll be more prepared for any sort of sneaky moves by the Zelensky government, especially recreating something like Kursk. That would be a tragedy if it is allowed to take place.
I completely agree, but the situation in Moldova, Transnistria, Pridnestrovia is unfortunate. Of course, we see the videos from Pridnestrovia, the rolling blackouts have started. I hear, though, that Moldova, they are still connected to the Turk Stream pipeline. And I know this is, it's coming out with a Gazprom issue. Some are accusing Gazprom of being pressured by Russia to try to get Maya Sandu out, by causing this issue. But of course, it's, the Transnistrians, the Pridnestrovians are having to rely on coal. So just really quick, Dimitri, before I give my 2 cents on what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, what's the situation there? Why exactly is that happening?
Yeah, essentially the Soyuz and Brotherhood pipelines of gas, they actually lead through Transnistria, and now, of course, the gas has been shut down by Ukraine. Again, Ukrainians are suffering, but also Transnistrians. This is that sliver of land occupied by a president and a regime which is very pro-Russian are experiencing a lot of energy issues. Now, Transnistria does not have an army. It has a few 10,000 sort of, you can say, glorified men who are just like the official Lebanese military. They're in a sort of heightened police state, and they won't be able to, again, hold back a Ukrainian offensive if Ukraine now chooses to strike in the next few months, I would say, against Transnistria. They won't be able to defend themselves adequately, and especially since our predictions, Conrad, haven't resulted in anything. We've talked about Russia, for example, striking against Odessa or Nikolaev, pushing more towards Transnistria, maybe supporting that sliver of land which is now being tortured, especially now during the winter in January from the cold. The lack of energy that the region is experiencing is going to weaken them even further, again, exposing another part of the Russian world to potential Ukrainian incursion. So this is another front which Ukraine may open, and the ball is completely in the Ukrainian court. Like, the Russians have a small contingent of troops stationed in Transnistria, I believe up to 2,000 Russian personnel are there, and they will be completely isolated. Now we have to understand Moldova, right? The election that took place last year, the Moldovan president, the government in Moldova is completely Western-backed and aligned. The reason why Moldova and Romania still have more energy than Transnistria is because they're receiving energy from, again, the Blue Stream gas pipeline, which runs through Turkey and across the south of the Black Sea into the Balkans, into Serbia, Hungary, and other places. So they are somewhat backed by the other additional energy coming from Turkey and, again, through the Russian Federation. But Transnistria, this was a calculated decision, 100% by the Zelensky government, potentially putting pressure on the Transnistria government. Now, you have to also understand the reason why Moldova is still not a member of NATO is, again, because Transnistria is this breakaway state, which brings into question the sovereignty and the sort of state legitimacy of Moldova. And this is why the country itself has been utilized by Russia as a sort of buffer state between NATO and the countries which align with the Russian Federation in the past. So the fall of Transnistria would mean, again, its annexation by a joint sort of annexation, perhaps by Ukraine, or maybe Ukraine would give all of Transnistria to Moldova, thus securing Moldova's membership into NATO. And again, NATO, that only means that NATO borders will expand closer towards Russia. And the fall of Transnistria would be a horrible, horrible beginning to the year. This is despite the fact that we see Russians obviously aware of this. We see Russian governors they've been speaking about all of 2024 about a potential strike against Odessa, the fact that Ukrainian ports need to be shut down, that Russia needs to have a joint sort of amphibian naval escalation in the Black Sea against Ukraine. And this is, we say this whilst Ukrainians are bombing Russian ships, like the two oil tankers that were shut down in the Taman Peninsula. This is near Kerch in the Black Sea, and that massive oil spill that happened. The Russian official media has claimed that these big oil tankers that were apparently hit by waves, and thus the waves caused the rupture in the ship's hull, thus causing an oil spillage in the Black Sea, a huge sort of ecological disaster. Some of the sort of right-wing Russians have been stating that potentially it was Ukrainian drones and those water-based drones that actually smashed into those oil tankers on Russian territory, which caused the massive oil spill. So the Russians are being hit quite hard on the Black Sea, and frankly, the fall of Transnistria could only exacerbate this sort of view that Russia is losing some of the territory, which rightfully so, I think, since the Russian Empire belongs to it, and its interests are being greatly suppressed. And again, the interests of the globalists and Zelensky in particular are being expanded. So Zelensky is really making big moves going into the beginning of this year, surprisingly so. And so he does have the sort of backing of the globalists. They're still strongly on his side. He's not necessarily losing favor amongst the Talmudic elites who essentially support him wholeheartedly.
I think the situation in Russia, before I move on to the U.S. very quickly, this is becoming a long show. I think Russia, they're doing many things that will, benefit them on the home front, that will make them more likely to be victorious. Of course, they are passing new laws that allow Russian police to not have to seek a warrant from a judge or anything like that, to just go after suspected illegal immigrants and round them up and get them on the process towards deportation. They also arrested and they fined 7 guys for dressing too gay. So, we can support all of these things, but at the same time, unfortunately, we reported on this. Russian Channel 1 News, they went to the front lines and were covering a bunker in the whole area where some troops were, and they didn't censor out the hammer and sickle and the Soviet Union flags, but they did censor out the Russian imperial flag that said, "We are ethnic Russians and we are proud." That was literally blurred on the TV. So, and I posted about how I think the Russians, they need to return from the SMO zone and do their own SMO on the Jewish media in Russia. But I think, Russia, lean more towards the mass deportations and finding gay people and less towards the hammer and sickle. And I think we will see the Battle of Pokrovsk be more successful than perhaps it would be otherwise. But we have to move on to the home frontier in the United States. Very tragic start to the year, unfortunate from an alchemical energy release. I don't know if it's a good sign. And of course, I think it just shows the times we live in. But of course, the big one that occurred, the New Orleans terror attack, that was when Shamsuddin Jamar, who was a Muslim who swore allegiance to ISIS-K, he rode a rented pickup truck into a huge crowd of people on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Louisiana. Then he got out with an AR-15 style rifle and started shooting. The total death count was 15, including himself. He was taken out by police, and then 35 people were injured. Of course, there was an ISIS flag tied to the truck. Of course, the silly, nonsensical DEI hires at the New Orleans FBI were like, this isn't a terrorist attack at the beginning, but that was very quickly debunked. And I, of course, posted about this on my X and Telegram accounts, but I was told, well over a year ago at this point, that ISIS, specifically ISIS-K, would be coming back with attacks in the Middle East and in the West. And of course, we saw the big ISIS-K attacks increase a year ago, right before even October 7th, the huge bombing at Soleimani's grave at the anniversary of his death. They've been increasing their attacks in Balochistan because we know ISIS-K, they fight both the Taliban on their border in Pakistan with Afghanistan, and they fight Iran and Persia. So very convenient for the enemies of the United States, of course. But he ostensibly pledged allegiance to ISIS-K, and there were even, I believe, 3 men and a woman, or 2 women and a man, or something like that, another group of people that were in his sort of little ISIS cell here. And he had come from Texas, and they had been planting bombs. All this stuff, of course, occurred. And he had rented the truck on Turo, which is actually the same app that this next story, the Las Vegas Cybertruck bombing outside of the Trump Hotel, Las Vegas, he also, and by he, I mean Matthew Livelsberger, both these people are soldiers. Matthew Livelsberger was active duty. Shamsuddin Jamar was supposedly honorably discharged from the United States Army. So again, I don't know if he was radicalized in the military or whatnot, but of course he had military training, and then of course pledged allegiance to ISIS-K, of course. And so the fact that he's military and the fact that it's ISIS-K, this very obvious U.S. front, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. And we, of course, have Matthew Livelsberger, who I've heard is a Green Beret, Special Forces, very highly trained. He was active duty at this point, not discharged. And he pulled up in a Cybertruck, apparently also rented by this Turo car-sharing rental app that was used in the New Orleans attack. He pulled up to the door of the Las Vegas hotel, and it exploded in this bomb. He's the only casualty. I believe 7 people were injured. And there were initial reports that he had been shot, or that he shot himself right before the explosion, but that is not true. I've just seen video of him moving around clearly alive as the explosion goes off. It's a crazy video. I'm sure if people follow us on the socials, they see the explosion, but it was crazy. And his is interesting insofar as he didn't pledge allegiance to ISIS, but there's some reports that he sent an email. This was on some Sean Ryan show. I don't know a lot about it, but there's other manifestos going around that he said this was a wake-up call because of Chinese drones, that the whole drone thing in New Jersey was related to Chinese drones, and that there's secret gravitational tech that only the US and China have, and that they've been secretly gaming each other, that China could blow up the White House and we could do something there. And it's this whole big balance of power, and that Elon Musk and everybody, all these people need to wake up. And it was this whole thing. And again, I have no idea how true or false any of this is, but I think in a lot of ways we have to realize, like Dimitri said earlier, the average American isn't going to distinguish between Iran and ISIS-K. They probably think Iran supports ISIS, which of course is nonsensical. And then you have this one, which I guess is about China. If these are sort of, even if they're kind of gone wrong and haven't gone fully to plan like their, MK Ultra handlers perhaps wanted these sleeper agents to do, it's clear that the direction of these is sort of a higher intervention in the Middle East, as well as sort of accelerate against China sort of situations. So again, I have no exact diagnosis on the full story on this. These have been very recent events, but the Cybertruck one is getting weirder and weirder. The other one, of course, seems like ISIS-K, which again, from the CENTCOM source that I had very much predicted this, and I've talked about that on the show in the past, how I thought ISIS-K was going to be coming back big, and I think this is the beginning of an era like that. If people remember, 2015, 2016, it was a huge Muslim terrorist attack, ISIS attack every weekend, and maybe we're going to see something like that. I really pray that we don't. But the other news, of course, in America, unless I want to hear your thoughts, obviously, on those attacks, but we have this big H-1B debate. Obviously, we saw Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, unfortunately, Donald Trump, they went full Jeet. They've gone full H-1B. They want to replace the American worker with Indians. They want no American tech workers to get jobs. They want us to, Elon at one point was freaking out saying he's going to go to war with anybody who's against H-1Bs. Vivek Ramaswamy saying that's because Americans and don't work hard and they value jocks over nerds. And everyone's talking about how Americans are stupid and they don't work hard. It's like, look, man, like you can believe that all you want, but don't look me in the face and tell me that Indians are smarter and work harder than Americans. Like, this is just nonsense. Like, maybe they'll work for a quarter of the wage and live 13 people in an apartment and smell like crap. But this idea that they don't innovate, the average IQ, even obviously it's only Brahmins coming over here, but they immediately take over. They only hire fellow Indians. And it's complete nonsense. This idea that American workers need to be competing with the entire world over who can, quickly race to the bottom and who can make the least money and increase shareholder value the most. That's just not acceptable. So not only are we not going to have H-1Bs, we're going to send a lot of these guys back too. Okay. So we can't have Jeet Town USA here. That's not what this is all about. Unfortunately, we are seeing a divergence from tech and MAGA. Unfortunately, Trump, some say Elon gave him up to $300 million, including the PAC money, over the course of the 2020 election. So Trump, of course, is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place there. He may not be interested in West Bank annexation or replacing the American worker with Jeets, but unfortunately, that was what paid for his election victory, those were their main issues. And that's what we're seeing between Miriam Adelson and Elon Musk. And obviously, whole big discussion about the Great Replacement, all of this on X, and Elon's had to talk about it, and it's all very interesting. So obviously follow us, @WorldWarNow_, follow me at GnomeRad on X to see all of this. But very interesting development indeed. But unfortunately, people are using it. Trump hasn't even been inaugurated yet, and he's already agreeing to, unlimited H-1Bs, Indian workers. Some people are even saying that the Trump second term is already over.
Yeah, that's right. It's looking quite bad. US in terms of foreign policy is losing on multiple fronts here. Again, there's a lot of questions as to exactly who the US is funding abroad. ISIS, all these stories are coming out in terms of exactly who brought these people over in the first place, right? It's not just the Islamists, but also some of these Ajit folks, which again were the crux of the H-1B discussion. But I think there's another curious angle here, Conrad, where we see essentially this online debate between the Pakistani rape gang supporters or those trying to play cover for them in the UK, and again the Indians who are very anti-Pakistani are speaking out in favor of migration. You see the whole Tommy Robinson angle as well, where he brings up actual real issues but plays cover for Israel. So he speaks out against Islamists, but he's in favor of Indian mass migration. And again, the Elon support for AFD and the anti-Muslim immigrant angle, whilst also, again, playing cover for these Hindus, which he's bringing over. Well, in reality, I think from a Christian perspective, we can generally come to the conclusion that regardless of which religion these people come from, whether it's Islam, Sunni, Shia, it doesn't really matter. Even if they're Alawites, they're not necessarily American by culture, by ethnicity, they're not composed of the same race that even funded America and created it in the first place. So there's a lot of consideration as to exactly what are the ethics of bringing in these people for economic growth in a nation. This debate is very important, but Elon Musk, again, he's pivoting on the very strong Ben Shapiro libertarian type angle, and he's even threatening to kind of shut down all the discourse on X, tweaking the algorithm. Again, a lot of people have been getting their blue check marks removed, and it's all very pro-Israeli, pro-Hindu, because we do understand that Hindu-Israeli alliance, it's very superficial in terms of the only reason the Indians and even the Prime Minister of India, Modi, the only reason they support Israel in the first place is because, again, they have some gripes and historical issues with their Muslim neighbors in Pakistan. And I'm not saying the Pakistanis are better, Conrad. I think we agree that even the Pakistanis have been doing in the UK, brought over in order to replace the native English people over there is horrible as well. And I think it's you have to choose the royal path, the middle ground, and just say that, no, how about no immigrants of any sort from that part of the world, from that subcontinent, into white countries in order to replace the native populations. I think that should be the position. That's the common sense angle. And no economic growth is worth agitating, displacing, or I think destroying the cultures which I think most of our Western countries have built in the first place through hard work. And there's no amount of Indian immigrants you can bring in that will cause America to re-flourish, especially at the state which it's in right now with the huge debt. Of course, Trump saying we should remove the debt ceiling entirely. And again, the hyperinflation caused by the fiat system overall, which again is Rothschild banker designed in the city of London and unfortunately enforced, and sort of we're all placed on this heroin needle of false economics, at least from the beginning of the 20th century. So these are all problems which scale up, and I don't think any 200 IQ Indian minority immigrants are going to solve that. And in theory, I think the H-1B visa debate, Conrad, has come to the conclusion that, well, it's actually not even the smartest Indians which are coming over, which are only composed of, it's probably less than 1% of the H-1B visa recipients who actually take these really high-skilled jobs in the first place. So the entire debate is essentially a psyop, and potentially, I think, overall, it's preparing people, even some of these Hindus, for this civilizational anti-Islamic move, I think, which is taking place in the Middle East, and potentially preparing the American people for a hypothetical regional war in the Middle East, maybe even against Iran, as we mentioned earlier. So I think overall, it's a massive psyop, and I really don't stand up for any of this suppression of free speech which is taking place. I think it's been a horrible debate recently because it's been very one-sided, and those who speak out against the Pajit infestation of America have been getting banned, shadow banned, and have their algorithms tweaked, not in their favor.
No, it's terrible. And if Elon wants people to use his app as the everything app and bank on it and trade crypto, why would anybody do that if you're just going to get banned if you go against his opinion on helping his bottom line? I mean, that's just nonsense. And I like what you said, Dimitri, how it doesn't matter if they're Indian or Pakistani, Muslim, Hindu. I mean, look, it's not about their religion or even what specific country they come from. They're not white. Okay. They're not European. They don't belong here. There's more people from these parts of the world in these countries than have ever been in these parts of the world ever. We're experiencing a global phenomenon that has never been seen as far as migration from the global south in these third world countries to the global north and the Christian west is concerned. And that's what we're seeing. And we don't need any more of them, whether it's Pakistani Muslims in the Middle East that I'm about to read you something about that rape little girls in Rotherham, or quote unquote 150 IQ Indians that take American jobs and drive down wages. This is all evil Jewish Zog warfare, and we're done with it. We're putting America first, and the white man is back. And that's what's happening. But unfortunately, in the UK, the white man is not back, and the Saxon is very much asleep. And I'm going to read this, and it's all tragic. I'm sure everyone's seeing the Rotherham stuff, but this is just about a big thing. Obviously, I'm sure people saw this clip, but this is the headline. A clip has been making the rounds on social media of Lord Pearson of Rannoch, saying there appear to have been upwards of 250,000 young white girls raped in this century, very largely by Muslim men. And that's what he says. And this is the kind of thing more likely, hold on. And then the article goes on to say, Britain's Labour government has introduced legislation to abolish the House of Lords, of which this Lord Pearson is a part of. People know the House of Lords, not elected like the House of Commons. It's different. Obviously, it has way less power, but it's the traditional higher seat, the Senate ostensibly of the British Parliament. And it's reserved for Britain's ancient hereditary peerage due to the notion that it is outdated. And this is why the Labour government wants to abolish it, and that they're all white men. So, of course, they don't want white men who can come up and say it as it is, and that hundreds of thousands of British girls were raped by Pakistani Muslims. And specifically, in the early 2000s, especially in the time when Keir Starmer himself was in charge of prosecutions in the UK, it was hushed up, and people even protected there's people who have on record, raped and abused 12-year-old girls, got them pregnant even, that have been out of prison for years now, still living near their victims, and the police are on record having said that, we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to give harsh sentences. We're not even going to prosecute some of these people because it would lead to this racial unrest. Well, I hope there is racial unrest now, because if there isn't, then that nation truly has fallen. Because if you read what happened in some of these places, what they did to some of these people, they killed some of these girls for almost coming out and exposing the whole thing with these pedophile rape rings is disgusting. And if I was a British man, I'd be getting a group of British people and marching somewhere and doing things to certain people. And I'm not going to get into details about that, but that's what I would be doing. And I think that's what more people need to be doing. But before we move on to Africa, I'll end on a bit of a nicer note in the United States, and this is from Fox News. A Greenland prime minister seeking independence following Trump acquisition comments. And that's, of course, the Prime Minister Mute Egede. People need to know Greenland, fully sovereign part of Denmark. He recently declared his intention for the island's future, taking major steps to gain independence from Denmark, saying it is necessary. His remarks following the December 22nd post on Truth Social by President Donald Trump advocating for the ownership and control of Greenland, focused on the basis of secession from Denmark. The upcoming new election period must, together with the citizens, create these new steps based on the foundations that we have already created. It is about time that we ourselves take a step and shape our future, also with regard to who we will cooperate closely with and who our trading partners will be. So, of course, I think Denmark, they don't have a lot of teeth these days. If there's a referendum, I think Greenland might very easily support independence. There's only like 30-something thousand people there. And if that happens, then I think it's inevitable that they become part of the United States. I don't know if it'll be like a Puerto Rico situation or if it'll be a 51st state or something in between, but we could easily give millions and millions of dollars to every single resident of Greenland for that to happen. And I'm sure they would accept it. And of course, that's going to be very relevant and important to U.S. strategic infrastructure and strategic positioning in the North Sea, specifically near the North Pole, and how they tried to develop and improve their navy to fight against the Russians in a place that, as far as the ice goes, they're much more prepared to fight naval warfare there right now. But I want to get your thoughts on Greenland, Dimitri. But before I do, we have to talk about Biden potentially being briefed on bombing Iran here in the last 2.5 weeks of his presidency. Obviously, that's going to be a major problem. He's also giving away his medals of freedom. He gave congressional medals of freedom to Hillary Clinton, George Soros, Messi. I felt bad for Messi. I'm like, you couldn't have given them to him on a different day. Like if I was Messi, I'd be like, just give it to me a few weeks later, like right before. I don't need to be on the same day as Hillary Clinton and Soros, but okay. Biden also canceled the Nippon Steel deal, which I don't know a whole lot about, but basically it would have been selling America's largest steel producer to a Japan-based company, or rather to have them operated, which Biden claimed it was, national security reasons. We don't want foreign companies making our steel that would fund our military industrial complex. But again, we pretty much own and occupy Japan ourselves. So I don't really see the word there. It's an interesting choice, but he's doing a lot here at the end with all of this. And the question is he going to actually bomb Iran in this lame duck session, which I don't know if they necessarily need to, because I think him and Trump are pretty much on the same page as far as that goes. So that covers that base with Biden, but I want to hear your thoughts on Greenland, which is something that's interested me since we started the show.
It's kind of part of the futuristic outlook, Conrad, on essentially who will control the Arctic sort of map into the future, because I know the US and again, Canada doesn't really have a functional navy in order to contest some of these zones. But at the moment, sort of the crisis within the Canadian government and the rhetoric from Trump where, he stated that we may potentially sort of bring Canada into our sort of sphere of influence more so than it is at the moment. And again, the relationship between the US, Canada, and the UK has only been strengthened over the last few years. Greenland is that piece of the puzzle, which again belongs to the Crown of Denmark. And its independence, I think, is very much in flux in terms of its independent choice of where exactly it will be. And we have seen precedent for this, unfortunately. It's set by Crimea, which had a referendum, and again, it joined Russia. I think it wouldn't be out of the scope of possibility and out of that realm if Greenland, for example, has a certain election and it doesn't have a large population to begin with, but future, and maybe even Pax Americana type of large naval bases set up there into the future to control that Arctic space. Again, with Russia also expanding its sort of polar exploration and those Rosatom nuclear icebreakers that it has designed. It has 7 or 8 of them actually traversing those northern waters. I think this is one of the future theaters of trade as well as potentially warfare that we'll be looking at in terms of like world affairs. So whether or not Trump does acquire Greenland over the next year, I think we'll see. It depends, I think, on the rhetoric that he kind of puts out. I think in terms of American interests, it's definitely a plus, given that Denmark has been under essentially deep globalist occupation ever since the First World War, and I would say definitely after the Second World War. The country is not independent. It's influenced by the various Masonic circles that have been running Europe for centuries at this point, unfortunately. And we even know the Danish crown. I mean, the King of Denmark is related to Nicholas II through his mother's side, but unfortunately we know that even her fate, she was put under essentially house arrest after the Russian Revolution and treated with much disrespect as a sort of princess of royal blood when she sought refuge, and she wasn't killed by the Bolsheviks, but she was essentially ordered never to speak about essentially who took over the country. She passed away in Denmark as an Orthodox Christian. Her grave, I believe, is still there in Denmark at the moment. So a very interesting sort of field of potential foreign inquiry, I think. But Greenland, Donald Trump taking it does paint a figure of him being the sort of avant-garde Caesar-esque type figure, I think, going into the future, literally expanding America in a state-like fashion. I mean, it fits his character and potentially would benefit Americans going into the future as long as America remains or sort of becomes free of Zog. I think that's the primary consideration. You don't want Greenland serving the interests of a future NATO Israel-aligned base. I think in the Atlantic, I think that would be quite horrible. But as we're looking at the map of like the world, the Atlantic, and again, we move to the Mediterranean, Africa, we do see the other NATO country of Turkey expand very deeply into countries like Morocco, selling Bayraktar drones to the Morocco Sunni Muslim majority government. We know Morocco has its own contingent. Again, it's that Judeo-Turkic angle, Conrad. We know Morocco has its own population of it. According to some Jewish legends, there was even an ancient Moroccan Jewish kingdom that existed there at some point, similar to Khazaria. Morocco is very questionably also very Judeo-Islamic in its sort of, and in that way is very much like Ankara-led Turkey since the fall of the Ottoman Empire in that regard. And it's not surprising that Turkey is expanding its influence, not just in Somalia and, of course, trying to influence that Ethiopia-Somaliland debacle, but also on the west side of Africa, again, influencing former French colonies, because we do know there is that Franco-Greek alliance that's kind of building itself alongside Egypt against the Turkey, Qatar, Azerbaijan opposition. So it's a very interesting debacle that will take place there in the Mediterranean as Turkey expands its influence. So, and that kind of touches on Russia as well, because Russia is not exactly a neutral player in this. Its bases were taken by Turkish proxies in Syria, and now the Russian-supported Field Marshal Haftar and his government are opposing the Turkish proxies in Libya at the moment, where warfare is also taking place. We recall Prigozhin, prior to his death in 2023, he did mention that Russia was essentially fighting against Turkish influence in Libya, and thousands of Russians. Prigozhin said, well, apparently 2,000 to 3,000 Russians have died in Libya in order to fight for Libyan sovereignty, according to Prigozhin. That's like the Wagner main talking points, that Wagner's fighting for the sovereignty of all these African countries. So as Russia kind of expands and it views itself as an opposition and in opposition to Turkey across all these various nations, right, even maybe partially aligning itself with Ethiopia in the future, we'll see where that goes. It will put itself in inevitable conflict, I think, with the rising neo-Ottoman project that Erdogan seems to be building.
No, that's very real. And unfortunately, as we see right now, this is a very recent report. The Turkish-backed GNU, which is the Government of National Unity, which is based in Tripoli, they control about a quarter, I would say, of Libya, but Tripoli being the capital and largest city on the far west coast, of the northern Mediterranean coast of Libya, that's what they control. They recently launched a military operation in the city of Zawiya against smugglers and pro-Haftar factions. The GNU forces captured the city from the local militia following their surrendering. And at the same time, though, this is from MSN, Russia is planning to move military gear from its naval base in Syria, and it comes amid uncertainty around Russia's role following the fall of Bashar al-Assad. We've heard, al-Jolani say that he doesn't want Russia to fully leave, that they want to cooperate, but amidst of these other Turkish advances here, it would make sense that Russia would be shoring up their situation in Libya. But again, for those looking at the map, the vast majority of Libya is controlled by the Haftar forces, the Libyan National Army, which all the border with Egypt. Benghazi on the coast is their biggest city, and other large cities there in the eastern, northern Mediterranean coast of Libya. But again, this is another wing of the Russian-Turkish proxy war that is going on across the Mediterranean that unfortunately it seems that Turkey is winning right now. And that's not exactly what we want to see amidst all of this, but it's how things seem to be going. But other things going on in Africa, of course, the situation between Ethiopia and Somalia. Turkey is also mediating this. Again, the Turkish era really is here, and some might say, but this is from Reuters. Ethiopia's defense minister traveled to Somalia on Thursday. A senior official in Mogadishu said the first bilateral visit since relations nosedived a year ago over an Ethiopian plan to build a naval base in breakaway Somali region. That's Somaliland, of course. And in a post on the X platform on Friday, Ethiopia's Foreign Ministry Affairs said the two countries had agreed to collaborate in the African Union peacekeeping mission and strengthen bilateral relations. Ethiopia has up to 10,000 troops in Somalia to fight Islamist militants from al-Shabaab, but Mogadishu has threatened to expel them if Addis Ababa did not renounce an agreement it reached a year ago with the breakaway Somaliland region. The preliminary deal called for Somaliland to lease a stretch of coastline for an Ethiopian naval base and commercial port in exchange for possible recognition of Somaliland's independence. And of course, this obviously is good that this is, not breaking out into hostilities. I think the Jubaland stuff in the south of Somalia is also being resolved, thankfully. But there were reports that came out that ultimately the Russian embassy had to deny, the Russian embassy in Sudan, that Sudan rejected Russia's offer of building a port. So there's information warfare going on. I don't know if perhaps the UAE is seeding this, because I think the UAE wants Russia to support the rapid support forces in Sudan against the government. But there were rumors going around that Sudan wasn't going to let Russia put its port that it was planning on the Red Sea that would be in Sudan. But apparently that was, of course, fake news. So the information warfare, continues to increase. I know you mentioned the Morocco situation, Dimitri. That's another wing of Turkish influence spreading across Africa. And if the U.S. is watching this happen, that's, a NATO force. I think the U.S. is going to fully embrace Turkey, sort of filling the void of France, ironically, in Africa, because French troops continue to withdraw from all of their former colonies. Of course, we heard recently Chad is one of the main countries they've pulled out of, and there's rumors that Turkish troops are going to come in and fill the void to prevent Wagner from taking over all of Chad, as they, have already taken over, obviously, Burkina Faso, Niger, these other countries. And the rumors are happening that in November 2024, Senegal announced the plans for French troops to withdraw from there. And by the end of 2025, it was more recently announced that's going to be fully undergone. And then just here in December, it was announced that Ivory Coast would also see the withdrawal of their French troops. So pretty much all of French West Africa, or former French West Africa, is being completely rid of, French soldiers and French influence. So obviously this is going to lead to a vacuum that Russia is most likely going to fill. And it seems that Turkey is going in. So I'm realizing how much this episode is vindicating the Russo-Turkish war, prophetic reality that we have predicted here. But unless you have anything else to say about what's going on in Africa, Dimitri, we do have to talk about Korea and the East briefly.
Yeah, I think the situation in South Korea is very interesting because on one hand, we have the growing sort of Russian-North Korea ties, with the North Korean troops now officially helping the Russian Federation forces in the Kursk KDO zone. While at the same time in South Korea, I think the issue of the South Korean president, that debacle that took place at the end of 2024 with President Yoon Suk-yeol, where he was facing essentially impeachment, where he was facing huge national criticism. Now at the moment, he's actually potentially, there's a warrant out for his arrest. And I believe there's a real clash between, say, police forces and actual presidential forces in the capital of Seoul, South Korea, where they're not actually able to take him under arrest because, again, there's a clash of jurisdictions. Like the police chief is not in charge of the presidential guard, the presidential security. And I think the South Korean military is also involved. So it's quite a debacle. And at the same time, for the first time perhaps in Korean history, the North Korean government looks more stable and in a sense, in control of the situation than even the South Korean government. This actually says a lot considering the tension that we saw build up over last year. I think it could spell potentially even a future front of warfare or some sort of civil disagreement between these two nations.
No, that's exactly what's happening. And of course, what occurred was there's an arrest out for, of course, President Yoon of South Korea. He declared martial law, and he's been still at the presidential palace. And the Corruption Investigation Office, in conjunction with, for example, the Seoul Metropolitan Police and other members of the Defense Ministry that aren't still loyal to Yoon, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of police ready to go in and conduct the arrest. But ultimately, the military, because even as they've impeached, he's not the acting president anymore. For example, they keep having these other members of his party elected and briefly installed as the acting president, the acting defense minister. They continue to stand by him. And for example, the military just didn't allow the police to arrest him. And I don't think the police wanted to fire on the military. So it's this sort of clash of institutions and powers. And of course, it's only allowed because Yoon is the pro-US candidate. And it's understood that the opposition is more pro-China and North Korea and all these other things. Again, South Korea, it's all Zog all the way down. None of these people are really good. But for better or for worse, it seems that North Korea, China could be spinning this as a way to increase influence in the country. But all of his supporters, of course, showed up. They've got like Stop the Steal flags, American flags, outside of the presidential palace. Very, very American colony-esque of them as a true colony. But as of right now, again, he hasn't been arrested. I think I don't know if they're going to impeach more presidents, but it's quite the development. And it's all tragic amidst the huge 179 dead Jeju Airlines Korean plane crash, which again, not as geopolitically relevant as the Azerbaijani plane that was shot down, but I believe it's the largest air disaster in Korean history. So a real tragedy there. Again, I think all these flights are these Boeing, whatever they're called, the specific Boeing model, these 737s that are falling out of the sky, having these landing gear failures. So if you're flying, be careful. And they got to stop killing these Boeing whistleblowers, because I think Boeing needs to answer for some of this, because it's actually starting to become problematic. But the only other news out of Asia, of course, there is Xi Jinping in his New Year's address very openly discussed Chinese reunification and the inevitability and, how much closer we are getting to Chinese reunification with Taiwan. We're, of course, seeing developments in Myanmar as the junta continues to slowly lose ground. I believe they released like 5,800 prisoners today in a bid to, I guess, win the goodwill of the people. I'm not sure if that's going to work. I'm sure if those people were pro-rebel, they will rejoin up with the rebellion. But I think that's what's going on in East Asia. I think unless you have anything else to say, Dimitri, we have to briefly discuss some church news. Unfortunately, here in the U.S. and on the ecclesiological front, GoArch is indoctrinating its youth into its neo-papal ecclesiology at the St. John Chrysostom Oratorical Competition, which is held every year by GoArch. One of the topics you can talk about is how the EP is considered first without equals, not just first among equals. Of course, referencing its place as basically the Eastern Pope among Orthodoxy. So this is very unfortunate. And of course, it ties directly into Ukraine, which is the fake tomos of autocephaly to the schismatics.
Yeah.
There is what really solidified this perspective that is now being apparently taught to children.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the greatest frontline, I think, of essentially geo-spiritual warfare that we see at the moment is in Ukraine. I think it's a great example of essentially how even Orthodox Christian hierarchs such as Patriarch Bartholomew can go wrong here and support literally the wrong side, because we see Metropolitan Epiphany Domenko celebrating Christmas on the 25th of December against the Julian calendar alongside the Uniate Svetoslav Shevchuk, so as the representative of the Pope in Ukraine. Essentially, they almost had a joint service. They did sit down at the same table with Zelensky as well as some rabbis, and they, of course, congratulated themselves on a great 2024 and the unity of Ukraine. So we do see the forces of evil literally coming together in Ukraine in support of this degenerate regime who holds power in Kiev. We also saw all kinds of other bizarre stuff towards Hanukkah and essentially the Jewish celebration of the simulacrum of Christmas, when the OCU chaplain of the military, so this is the priest in charge of the schismatics priests in the Ukrainian military, Father, I say this in quotation marks, Oleg Sknar, assisted the chief rabbi of Kiev in lighting the Hanukkah menorah. Okay, so this is the OCU Patriarch Bartholomew-led Ukrainian schismatic priest. And again, you had another insane statement from, say, Father in quotation marks, Basil Kosichenko, who openly stated on Hanukkah and on Christmas on the 25th of December that in order for Ukrainian unity, perhaps all Ukrainians should convert to Judaism. And at first it seemed like a joke, maybe like an April Fool's joke, but no, he actually stated that on Hanukkah. This is a priest who serves under Metropolitan Epiphany Domenko, the false Metropolitan of Kiev, as well as Patriarch Bartholomew, calling people to become Talmudic Jews. I mean, you cannot get more ridiculous than that. And of course, on New Year's Eve, you had the former president of Ukraine, he who began the schism with Pompeo and unfortunately people from the Donald Trump administration, Petro Weitzman Poroshenko, like a crypto Jew. He participated in this staged, bizarre New Year's Eve celebration where he had this actress, some sort of prostitute dressed as the Theotokos, carrying a javelin missile launcher on stage. So this is the Saint Javelin Ukrainian blasphemous meme. And of course, they were doing all kinds of jokes about Ukrainian culture and how it's defeating Russia. And of course, Saint Javelin was supporting Poroshenko and Zelensky in this particular little play that they staged at the commencement of 2025. So it's quite a dark, foreboding omen, I think. They're very satanic. And I think, as most news that come out of Ukraine regarding the persecution, the really sad news, I think, just kind of, not to end the show on a bad note, but I think we did hear about the death of Dmitry Diakonovich, a young man, one of the stepsons, the adopted son of Metropolitan Longin of Banchen, one of the most persecuted metropolitans of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the canonical church, that is. His son died on the front lines. He was conscripted and forcefully drafted by Ukraine, and he was killed, I believe, somewhere on the front lines of the SMO war, fighting for, unfortunately, the Ukrainian Zelensky regime. And that funeral was very hard to watch, very heart-wrenching. The Metropolitan collapsing to his knees near the coffin of his adopted son in church as they were saying their farewells at the Orthodox funeral. So the Jewish spiritual war is not just taking place in Syria, where HDS and Turkey guarantee sort of the spiritual freedoms of the Syrian people. It's also happening in Europe, in places where essentially Christianity was the norm for hundreds of years. Now the oppression, I think, is taking a full force, and I think it's quite bizarre that the persecution of the church is really still continuing on 2 years into the conflict. Ukraine and Zelensky still haven't essentially conceded that Christianity and Orthodox Christianity are an integral part of the population, and they continue to oppress it even when it doesn't benefit them in any sort of geostrategic sense whatsoever. It's almost like they're fighting against God, regardless of what kind of material negative sides that may have. essentially agitating their own population. So we know that it's definitely the servants of the devil and Satan himself who stand behind these people.
Well, we see in Syria, of course, all the HTS militants and others attacking Christmas trees. And we know that now they're blaspheming Christ and saying that Christianity and those that worship Christ and don't honor the prophet, they're making first graders going to learn this now in school, saying, enforcing radical Islam and whatnot. What's going on in Ukraine, we've heard of their enforcement of the schismatics and the anti-Russian stuff. This is from Union of Orthodox Journalists. Ukrainian member of parliament Oleksandr Dubensky, he said that clergy will receive military exemptions in coordination with state services of ethnopolitics and freedom of conscience, specifically talking about resolution number 4, which would have allowed exemption from conscription to all clergymen. According to the MP, this is what he said. Thus, the parishes that will move to the OCU will be exempt. That's the schismatics. And those who will not transfer will go to war. Those that do not will go to war. This will both improve the statistics and serve utilization purposes. So he's just openly saying that if you don't join the schismatics, we're going to send you to the front line to die. So This is obviously satanic. Dubinsky, obviously could be, but, I'm suspicious of his origins there, of course. But that's neither here nor there right now. What's happening is much like Metropolitan Longan is losing his son, being conscripted and sent to the front. More and more people are going to lose their spiritual fathers and their shepherds being sent to the front. And again, I think the goal is to force them to, if they even want to see anything akin to orthodoxy, they'll have to go to a schismatic parish because the priests will have been cleared out. But thankfully, over all these years, the persecution has only strengthened the UOC, the canonical church, because they continue to have more numbers than the schismatics always. All their services are much more full. So continue to pray for Syria, for Ukraine, for everybody involved in all of this, because that's ultimately what this is all about. We need to repent and pray, and that's the only way that we can truly make a difference amidst all of this. But of course, we have to wrap this up. This has been a huge show. We apologize for the length, but there was so much to talk about. Please, 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 those of you listening here, if you are a paid supporter, especially if you aren't, please consider supporting. But especially if you are, please hit the link below and join the Q&A thread and ask us a question for an upcoming Ether Hour Q&A. I believe we already have a solid amount of questions, but we want to hear from more of you. We know that a lot of you that pay to get behind the paywall haven't asked a question yet. We want to make sure that you get all of your perks for supporting the show, because it really means a lot to us. So please, please click that link down below wherever you are listening, whatever platform, Substack, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Click that link down below, go over to the Substack and ask that question. We really want to hear from you and answer those. But with all of that, Dimitri, I will leave you with the last words on this huge week of World War III analysis.
Yes, thank you for listening to the 101st episode, the first episode recorded in 2025. And I wish all Orthodox Christians on the old Julian calendar a Merry Christmas on the 7th of January. And again, Happy New Year. We hope that the year will bring many more good news. And especially, we wish you all a great 2025, I think. Thank you, Conrad, for recording this lengthy episode. And next week, I think there'll be even better news, hopefully, that we can cover, and hopefully some good ones too.
No, I totally agree. And yes, Merry Christmas to all of our old calendar listeners. I know that is a large portion of you. And, I visit old calendar parishes as well. I hope I might even make it to a Christmas service this year myself, because I wasn't near a church on the 25th. But again, thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to support us on the Substack, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Get behind the paywall. It is how you can help the show keep going. You'll get access to all 60 plus of our Ether Hour episodes, so much stuff uncensored that you wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. Even on X, it would still get censored there, some of it. So be sure to get behind that paywall. There is really no other content like it, and it keeps these World War Now weekly shows public and free for people to enjoy as well. So be sure to follow us elsewhere, World War Now _. That is our X. Be sure to follow me on X as well at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We post 24/7 news updates there. It's really, really good stuff. If you like listening elsewhere, Spotify and Apple Podcasts both are available. So add us on there. Even if you don't listen there all the time, please go there, rate us 5 stars. Go to YouTube as well and subscribe. I know all of you have YouTube channels. So if you're subscribed here on Substack, please head over to the YouTube channel as well and subscribe there. Share all the links with your friends, whichever one you think they would listen to the most. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Share it to them. Get the content out. It really, really helps us out. And again, thank you so much to our paid subscribers for making it all possible. So thank you all so much. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.